Chapter 451 Showdown with Inquisitors, Part 2. As Oxium was repeatedly stabbed in the back, Jake's glowing blade went straight for his throat. A flash of white light momentarily blinded them, and a black steel helmet rolled to the ground. Simultaneously, Drastin in his troll form continued to smack Kroyern with his fists. The helmet, and then the Inquisitor's armor, gradually broke apart, and whatever was inside was reduced to a pulp within seconds. Soon there was nothing left but a deformed pile of metal on the ground in the middle of a black coat rolled into a bundle. Victory seemed within reach. Yet, it was at that very moment that Jake and Vincent noticed something was wrong. After being decapitated, Oxium's headless body did not collapse, but remained in the same defensive stance. Not easily intimidated, Vincent kicked the corpse forward, but was horribly shocked when the body bounced all the way down the hall as if he had just kicked a football. By way of background, his bloodline was that of a water elf, and in addition to his affinity for water and an apparent bonus of strength and dexterity, it made his body exceedingly light. He weighed only 9 kilograms in all. The body he had just kicked weighed practically nothing. Jake instantly lunged towards the decapitated body to protect Will, but as he got close to the businessman, he was buffeted by a deafening blast from behind him, as if a hurricane had just blown in. With a bad feeling, he turned Oxium's lifeless body over with the tip of his machete and discovered that where the neck should have been, there was nothing. Just air. The entire armor was completely empty. Fuck. By the time he turned around, Vincent was already spinning in the air, being carried away by a tremendous tornado. Because of his 9 kilograms, he had almost no way of resisting such a wind if he couldn't find a surface to hold on to. His cousin tried to draw the bow he wore on his shoulder after emptying the bullets from his rifle, but the tornado suddenly folded in on itself and smashed him into the ground. Just before impact, he condensed a yellow ether shield on his back, but that didn't stop the air from being forced out of his lungs. At the same time, Drastin, who seemed to be in complete control, strangely began to slow down the frequency of his punches as if he were running out of air. Squinting his eyes, Jake saw silver vapor escaping from Kroyern's battered body and seeping into the player's body through his mouth and nostrils. Drastin quickly began to tremble, and his strength quickly deserted him. He reeled backwards, caught in a coughing fit, before falling on his bottom. Jake could hear his massive heart racing to deal with the unprecedented intoxication. His thick skin began to exude the same silvery vapor that had nearly suffocated him. To prevent the steam from approaching Drastin while he was weakened, Jake threw a huge fireball at Kroyern's armor and another into the tornado, playing with his cousin. As the flaming projectile approached, Kroyern shrieked with fright against all odds, and his battered armor resumed its original form. He reabsorbed the silver vapor into his armor and rolled to the side to avoid the explosion. As for Oxium, a groan of pain resounded inside the tornado, but instead of disappearing, the wind incorporated the flames, and the fire tornado became 10 times more lethal. However, this was what Jake wanted. Taking advantage of the Inquisitor's confusion, he rushed into the flames to retrieve Vincent before he was burned more severely. His cousin had protected himself in time with his ether, but with his tiny weight he was completely helpless, doomed to be centrifuged within the tornado until he died. Jake was the exact opposite. He was so heavy that passing through the flame tornado was like a stroll for him. With his senses, he found Vincent with no problem and picked him up with his telekinesis. Given the circumstances, Vincent didn't dare resist and let himself be magically transported out without complaining. Jake then caused a huge detonation by releasing a telekinetic blast of his own, and the tornado dissipated momentarily. Taking advantage of the gap, Jake and his cousin regrouped with Drastin. Drastin had recovered from his intoxication, while Vincent was not injured. His only regret was that he had lost his rapier somewhere in the process. Damn it, his cousin gnashed his teeth in ill humor. What the hell are these fucking freaks? I can kind of get why these Inquisitors all have the monster role. Old Ghost. Jake sought advice from the deceased passenger given the urgency of the situation. The late fluid wielder materialized beside him and flinched when he saw the 2 abominations they were facing. What was once Kroyern was now a sort of humanoid silver liquid, though still wearing his armor and visored helmet. It was just that due to the breaches in the armor, his true form was no longer sealed so tightly, and the liquid was trying to occupy all the space available to it. Oxium, on the other hand, had terminated the tornado, and his body had condensed into a blob of air with undefined contours. He wasn't a fluid ghost, but he didn't have a body either. He was just a bunch of air existing thanks to some unknown sorcery. The trio quickly thought of a way to eliminate the two Inquisitors, but they felt somewhat at a loss. Jake had his own idea for exterminating Oxium, but how was he supposed to stop him from escaping? What if I burn him? Jake thought inwardly. He remembered how panicked Croyan looked when he got hit by a fireball. Instead of taking it head-on, he had decisively chosen to dodge. Oxium hadn't taken kindly to his flames either, but his body showed no apparent signs of damage. After all, he just had to find more air to replenish the damaged part. Most importantly, he still had to figure out what it meant to damage air. What were your symptoms when you breathed that vapor, Drastin? Will asked telepathically with a sense of urgency. He was still hidden behind the wall, but he had been keeping track of the battle all the while. The Black Warrior was taken aback by the voice in his head, but answered with a straight face. Physical weakness, fever, tremors, burning in my throat and lungs. He listed hastily. After that, nausea and cramps. My oracle status says it's mercury poisoning, whatever it is. Will, Jake and Vincent's eyes twinkled at the same time. Croyan would be a nightmare for Drastin or me, but for you it should be a breeze. Vincent chuckled wickedly. Jake nodded confidently. Now the question was how to handle Oxium. Ideally, the hall should be sealed, but that would require a tremendous amount of energy. The gateway designed for such a castle was ambitious and large enough to fit through a Drastin in his troll form. That was a lot of rock to move and cool down in a very short time. You can also locate his fluid core, Master. The fluid ghost suggested patiently. They failed their ascension to Grand Master, but the fluid accumulat over their lifetime remains the source of their power. Jake tried to apply the advice by searching for their fluid signature via his own fluid core and Mertharian site, but he detected nothing concrete. There's fluid everywhere. I can't find a single fluid core. He admitted honestly. Either he was correct, or his perception was too weak. The old ghost felt downcast for a short while, before coming up with something else. Can you damage their souls directly? Jake paused as he considered the suggestion. Even if these two Inquisitors no longer had human bodies, they still had a spirit body and a soul that could perform these feats. He just had to find them and strike hard. Let's try this. For this counterattack, Drastin and the two fluid knights attacked Oxium to keep him busy, leaving room for Jake to do Croyan. Vincent kept his distance and stayed in support with his bow, so he wouldn't get swept away again in a tornado. Jake wasn't the only one with a plan. His cousin's bow was clearly not a normal weapon. As soon as he pulled the bowstring tight, a giant ice arrow like the one that had ambushed Croyan in the beginning condensed again. As soon as it was ready, Vincent released the string and the projectile pierced the air. Oxium grunted in disdain as he felt the arrow pass through him, but the grunt quickly turned to a high-pitched howl as it exploded into a cloud of snow. The air grew heavier, and the cold mist made his presence more distinct. The barbarian ducked forward to avoid the blow, but a long, 3-centimeter deep gash lacerated his back. Speed was not his strong suit. As a second wind blade approached, a second ice arrow struck it in midair, causing it to explode. Oxium was about to unleash a deluge of wind blades when a metallic wail of anguish sounded not far from him. Jake had made his move. Chapter 452 Showdown with Inquisitors, Part 3. Aired. The gut-wrenching shriek of pain and the ensuing blast of heat startled Oxium and his opponents alike. Subconsciously, they turned their heads and saw a pile of liquid mercury being squashed mercilessly in the hands of a human torch. Mercury was a heavy white metal with the rare property of being liquid at room temperature. It solidified at 38.842 degrees Celsius and evaporated at 356.62 degrees Celsius. In its pure form, it was a neurotoxic and reprotoxic agent capable of causing all sorts of harmful effects on health, depending on the quantity accumulat by the body. In case of acute intoxication, one could experience the same panoply of symptoms that Drastin had suffered from earlier. Such a body had severe limitations. Nonetheless, for a warrior specializing in brute force like the Troll Slayer, it was the worst possible matchup. Having the strength to pulverize a mountain would make no difference here. On the other hand, if it was someone like Jake or Enya who was handling it, this Inquisitor didn't stand a chance. For Mercury had two major drawbacks. First, its density. At 13.6 grams per cubic centimeter, Kroyern's Mercury body weighed over 1.5 tons. For Jake, this was nothing, but for the fluid master who had just begun his physical evolution, it was a real burden. To move, he constantly expended a lot of energy, resorting to a form of telekinesis. As a result, Kroyern was a rather slow fluid wielder, his precognition and superhuman reflexes being completely wasted on him. The second major weakness was his critical vulnerability to high temperatures. Unable to dodge Jake's charge because of his heaviness, as soon as his body came into contact with flames exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius, it evaporated virtually on the spot. To ruin his chances of escape, Jake trapped him with his telekinesis and set about incinerating him alive. The lump of mercury was compressed to the size of a basketball and quickly reached an unbelievable temperature. The metal ball turned white hot as it met the requirements of a plasma, and Kroyern's tortured screams were quickly replaced by silence. Just when Jake thought he was done with him, his senses registered a change in the surrounding fluid. A tremendous dark energy suddenly converged on the glowing metal ball and was quickly sucked into it, as if it were a black hole with an endless appetite. Jake then felt a counter-pressure resist his telekinesis, and the mercury ball suddenly regained some volume. "Let go and die," Jake snapped. Roar. A terrifying roar suddenly erupted from the compressed mass of mercury. In horror, Jake saw a familiar monstrous face appear on the surface of the plasma, followed by a glowing claw that tried to reach his face. He instantly knew what was going on: monster transformation. These aliens seemed to revel in heat and radiation, both of which hastened their evolution. Faced with his approaching death, the Inquisitor had given up his humanity, though he was hardly human to begin with. Yet, the most likely hypothesis was that Kroyern was already dead or passed out. As soon as his consciousness had waned, the monster within him had taken over. The entire action took a while to describe, but only took a couple of seconds in total. When the monster manifested, Axiom and the others had just recovered from their stupor. Out of the corner of his eye, Jake saw Axiom dash to his comrade's rescue with a raging gust of wind in his wake, and he knew he had to end it quickly. "Take cover," he yelled telepathically as he aimed the compressed mercury ball at Axiom's air body. None of them thought twice about it. Will had already rushed out of the hall with his bodyguards, while Drastin and Vincent broke off a portion of the wall to protect themselves behind a huge boulder and a water barrier. If Axiom attacked seriously, it could be inconceivably fast. The hurricane condensed into a streamlined air bullet, spinning around, and so condensed you could barely see it. As if fired by a sniper, Axiom shot straight for Jake's heart at several times the speed of sound. It was a dangerous move for the Inquisitor, spurred on by his panic. Like Kroyern, he no longer had a physical body, so he depended on his fluid control to achieve all of this. By condensing the air in this way to boost his speed, he was exposing his fluid core to enemy retaliation. Predictably, Jake easily anticipated the air bullet's trajectory and swatted Axiom away with a backhand as it came into range. The deflect was perfect, and the Inquisitor ricocheted down the hall behind him. After that, Jake unleashed hell. The fiery mercury ball hit the same wall as Axiom at roughly the same time, and without telekinesis to hold it together, the mercury plasma ball exploded with a thunderous shockwave. Jake held his breath so as not to absorb any vapor and restrained the expansion of the detonation with his powers. The mercury fiend trying to come to life was blown away as mercury vapor with no chance of reconstituting itself, and Jake enclosed each portion of mercury in a rectangular force field to nip the possibility in the bud. Soon the vapor cooled and became liquid again, then completely inert. Jake then formed a vent to clear the mercury-saturated air from the hall and remove the telekinetic barriers when he felt it was safe enough. Jake did not move immediately. With Murthari in sight and his spirit body deployed, he vigilantly scanned the half-destroyed hull for traces of Axiom. The air-formed Inquisitor had taken some damage, but he didn't think it was enough to deal with it. "Where is he?" "Right here," a deep voice said placatingly right above him. Looking up, Jake spotted a tiny crack in the ceiling, which he probably wouldn't have noticed straight away without the voice's intervention. The crack was incredibly thin, just wide enough to allow a draft to pass through. Intuitively, he thought it was Axiom taunting him, but as he compared this calm, soothing voice to Axiom's meek, airy one, he immediately made note of several differences. "Who are you?" Jake shouted to the individual on the other side of the crack. In response, a trail of dark shadow and smoke seeped through the crack and glided down the walls in a split second to reform a human figure before him. Light leather armor, protective gloves, hood and mask to hide the lower face. 2 short swords, a bow, a portable mini crossbow tucked under his wrist, and a host of other accessories and weapons, each more deadly than the last. Jake didn't even try to argue and lunged forward, grabbing the stranger's throat with his right hand and ramming him into the closest wall. "Hefies, give me one good reason why I should let you live?" Jake growled as he pressed the tip of a claw against his heart. His lips were curled up, revealing his long, translucent fangs. Hefi's Vist was one of Avro's allies in the previous round, an Aegean assassin specializing in shadow magic. He was one of his sworn enemies in this ordeal. With the Australian now serving Isbius and his inquisitors, this player's presence did not bode well. Far from panicking, the accused assassin raised his hands in the air before pointing to the contents of his left hand with his eyes. With his fluid and ether vision, Jake immediately identified what was in it: a fluid core. About the size of an apple, its opaque surface gave off a tiny white light. If one listened carefully, one could hear the breeze of the wind just as one could hear the sea by sticking one's ear against a shell. "Axiom," Jake whispered with surprise. "Himself. My gift to prove my good intentions." Hefi smiled. Taking a closer look at his eyes, he looked quite handsome and young. Jake probed his expression for a long moment before deciding to release him for the time being. "Give me the fluid core," he ordered. The Aegean assassin obeyed readily. He had never intended to keep the loot, even though he was the one who had ended the Inquisitor's life. Meanwhile, the gunfire and explosions outside had also stopped. Drastin, Vincent, and Will returned a few minutes later with relieved expressions. Drastin had regained his normal height and looked as dashing as before the battle. He hadn't been able to do much against those inorganic entities, but he hadn't really suffered either. Most of the damage in the hall had been done by him alone. Vincent, comparatively speaking, was rather disappointed. He had let himself be trapped by Axiom and had just realized that being too light had not only advantages. He had also found that the Inquisitor had never once taken them seriously. When he was trapped in the tornado, the Inquisitor could have executed him in no time if he had wanted. It was his greatest humiliation since he first entered these ordeals. Will was his usual self and had already put on gloves to inspect the battlefield for treasure. Upon discovering a pinecone-sized fluid core covered in liquid mercury at the end of the hall, he almost fainted with excitement. His 2 fluid knights helped him pick it up. As proof, Paveo and his troops arrived soon after and gave him a meaningful look. The squad of soldiers was down to 6 from the original 9. The 2 natives accompanying them were absent, as well as the man with the bazooka. After taking roll call and making sure no one was missing, Jake turned to Hefies and uttered, "Now speak." Chapter 453, It Can Happen to Any of Us. The rest of the night passed without a hitch. After reaching an agreement with Hefies, Jake resumed building the castle, this time with the other survivors' assistance. It turned out that Hefies was not one of the monsters. To prove this, they would have to wait for Peter's return, but a simpler solution presented itself in the form of Ostrexera. She used her clairvoyant role to identify his roles in front of everyone and confirmed that he was not one of them. The ghastly female player had also joined the battle as promised to defend the village, single-handedly eliminating more than half the players and natives sent to fight alongside Hefies. She was covered in blood and gore, and a devilishly inhuman grin crept across her ghoulish face. While Hefies was no monster, he was no angel either. In addition to his original farmer role, the special role he had acquired shortly after the first round began was Assassin. Villager, Assassin LVL 3, rare, upgradable, can accept 3 contracts each night to eliminate another villager. In addition to being allowed to go out at night to complete his missions, the assassin is rewarded or penalized according to the success of the eliminations. Ability, Stealth LVL 3. Requirements: accept a contract, and successfully eliminate the target. The Aegean assassin did not try to absolve himself of the previous murders. He simply said that a job was just a job. In his line of work, he didn't care who the target was as long as he got paid. The only reason he was willing to switch sides was that he ultimately preferred the good guys when he had the freedom to choose his employer. In the previous round, it would have been complicated for him to put a sign outside his door like Jake with a notice, "Assassin accepting assassination missions." That was why, when Daryl had attacked him on the first night, he had taken the opportunity to negotiate a deal with the dead doctor. After all, killing was all he knew. The current round presented him with better options, but more importantly, he didn't have much of a choice. Avros and 4 of the Inquisitors, now down to 2, had formed a monster village by gathering around this woman known as Grandmaster Isbius. No one knew where she came from. The targeted attack on Jake's village earlier in the day was no accident. Avros and their previous first-round qualifiers had all been teleported to the same village. That's why they knew from the start where Jake and the other survivors of their first round would respawn. The only unknown was when. In the end, Jake and the others had taken longer than expected, but it had also given them the breathing room they needed to flourish. Unfortunately, the appearance of Isbius had dashed their hopes. Their trio of Avros, Hephis, and Luke were crushed in a matter of seconds, unable to do anything. Avros and Luke, being monsters themselves, had willingly embraced the new cause, but for the assassin these were the most perilous days of his existence. Unlike the other 2 players who had forsaken their own souls, Hephis had been waiting for Jake's appearance to change sides. Thus, Jake and the Aegean assassin signed a contract stating that all of Hephis' next targets would be decided by Jake. The only clause was that Hephis retained the right to refuse or even break the contract if Jake lost his mind or turned into a monster. At dawn, Jake and the others didn't even try to be discreet anymore and pushed themselves hard to finish the castle. With his powers, the monument he was building was nothing like the original blueprint. If the castle of the blueprint was a ravishing naked and defenseless maiden, the new fortress was a 3m tall bodybuilder knight in heavy armor. A bit like a wooden hut of 1 cubic meter wrapped in 20-meter thick stone walls. Seen from the outside, the new castle looked like a smooth and homogeneous cube of rock 50 meters on each side. If not for the few spiky towers protruding from the top, the moat encircling it, the large gate, and the drawbridge, it would have been impossible to guess that it was supposed to be a castle. This kind of wonder was only possible with Jake's magic and the assistance of Drastin and the other players whose strength far exceeded that of the natives. One good thing done. Jake sighed with relief as he contemplated his handiwork. A glance at his fluid card confirmed that his Lord, Baron, role was no longer grayed out. Exhausted, he wiped the perspiration off his forehead. He was far from the only one drenched in sweat. Those like Will who didn't shine with physical strength and stamina were literally on their knees, close to passing out. I have 2 other potential allies in a nearby village. Hephis revealed as he stood next to him. Mihangel Sarkaran, a wood archmage, and Ralner Bainan, a fire knight. Jake remembered the leaf green-haired idiot present at the meeting on the Titan Pearl. Ralner was the calm, composed knight who attended him. He didn't dither too much about why the assassin hadn't joined them. No doubt he had his reasons. They control this village? He inquired. They do, but not for long. Hephis did not hide his gloom. The attack that your village suffered yesterday is what the other villages are going through every day. At first, they recruited those who agreed to surrender, turning them into monsters, but for the past 2 days they have been eradicating everyone without exception. Whoever this Isbius is, she wants to end it all. How many villages are there in total? Is this the only monster village we need to be wary of? Jake continued to question him. I can answer that. A female voice sounded behind him. Enya, Tim exclaimed before throwing himself into her arms. The poor teenager starved for affection without Lily to keep his hormones in check. Will gave Essia a quick hug and nodded to Kawani and Svara behind them. Jake focused instead on the breathtaking hottie bringing up the rear. Carmen, why did you come back? He exclaimed in disbelief. When she had left, he was convinced she was off to find the rest of her faction. Seeing her blank stare and lack of reaction, he realized that something was wrong. Sadly, he wasn't familiar enough with her to take the initiative. Just a few days earlier, She was trying to bleed him dry. In addition to Carmen, there were also two other unexpected people in this group. The first was Avi Sean Min, recognizable by her youthful appearance, small size and flat chest despite her almost 40 years of age. The second, hooded in black and its face obscured by a veil of darkness, left no doubt as to its identity, another Inquisitor. Recognizing an Inquisitor, all the survivors' hair stood on end and they drew their weapons as one. Jake even striked preemptively, smashing her with a giant telekinetic palm descending from the sky. Drastin shifted into troll form and swung one of the unused tree trunks at her like a javelin, while Hephi's distorted the Inquisitor's shadow into dark stakes and speared her through and through from behind. Stop! Stop it! She's with us! Avi yelled as she steeled herself in front of the wounded Inquisitor to keep them from sending a barrage of deadly attacks at it. Step aside! Drastin roared in fury as he brandished another tree trunk like a club and prepared to slam it down with all his might. Meanwhile, Hephi's didn't flinch and continued to branch out and twist the shadow of the immobilized Inquisitor to butcher him without mercy. Jake didn't let up on his force field either. When Avi entered the range of influence of his attack, she too was flattened like a pancake against the ground and began to spit blood. Jake, please. Enya squeezed his hand with a pleading tone. Glancing at her, he finally noticed the worry and heavy dark circles on her face. Her noble air was absent, and her beautiful eyes held a hint of supplication. Taking a deep breath to calm himself, he returned his attention to the Inquisitor on the ground and saw that it had not once tried to resist. All right, stop attacking, Jake ordered wearily. This urge to kill was a bit too strong. Perhaps he had been too optimistic. In a day or two, it would be hard for him to contain his homicidal impulses. Hephi's released his control, and the Inquisitor's shadow became lifeless again. It turned out to be a bit more complicated for the troll. Roar. Drastin kept smashing down the tree trunk like a madman. With drool on his lips and eyes clouded with madness, he appeared determined to persevere until the Inquisitor was reduced to mush. Luckily, he just lost his mind. Without his wits, he's just another monster. Jake Groened. Borrowing from Croyern's method, Jake depressurized the air around the troll's head, and when it began to suffocate, he leapt behind its neck and punched the back of its skull with his full strength. His arm pumped with red ether, and a telekinetic push further increased its power. It was enough. Drastin's huge head was thrown forward, and his eyes rolled back for a brief second. The huge troll collapsed on his stomach, shaking the ground, but got up almost immediately. However, the anger within him was gone. Sorry. Drastin scratched his head sheepishly as he regained his human size. It's okay. Jake and the others forgave him with no hard feelings. What had just happened to him could happen to any of them from now on. Chapter 454 Extra Mission. Later, the group gathered in the castle's brand new meeting room. Not having furnished the place yet, they made do with the spare table and rock stools that Jake had made on a whim. Tapping his fingers on the table in a sullen mood, Jake stared long and hard at Avi and the Inquisitor before breaking the silence. We took out 2 Inquisitors a few hours before you got here, he stated defiantly, getting straight to the heart of the matter. I apologize for our hostility earlier, but I still need a good reason for not doing it again. Drastin and Hephi's nodded beside him, and even Will bobbed his head in support. Enya stifled a sigh, but took it upon herself to make the introductions. You already know Avi. She runs the largest village in the second round. Regrettably, it's mostly Titan Pearl soldiers. The players have mostly gone their separate ways and formed their own villages. Because of the circumstances surrounding our presence in this ordeal, they are more susceptible to corruption. As a result, most players are now either monsters, criminals, or dead. Jake and the other survivors frowned. This was not good news. Paveo and Hephi's had already told him all this, but it was not pleasant to hear it again. What about this Inquisitor? Jake glared at the latter, who was surprisingly behaving quite well. I'm getting to that. Enya replied wearily. Let me say it. Avi interrupted her, showing for the first time a maturity and gravity befitting of her rank. Ilfora here is an Inquisitor working for Sigmar. A shiver of horror ran down their spines. Jake didn't overreact this time, but his face tensed up. Sigmar Elsenire? Isn't he supposed to be our enemy? Will exclaimed with incomprehension. Jake shared the same sentiment. According to the diary entry they had discovered, Sigmar was the fluid grandmaster who had betrayed the consortium and moved to this station with his men to conduct experimental biological research. The parasites that abounded in this place were the result. At that moment, the fluid ghost he had saved materialized next to him and transmitted telepathically with a shudder of guilt in his voice. Master, because of the events of yesterday, I didn't have time to make my report. About Sigmar. He was free to return to B-842 at any time. If he shared his findings with the other members of his faction, they would all be able to leave this wretched place. Kyle and Daniel had already completed their main mission from the moment the Titan Pearl docked at Yotai Shuren 3. Tim, Kevin, and Will simply had to survive until the mystery of the emergency beacons was solved, while Sarah, Essia, and Vincent had to find at least one clue. The only person who needed to solve the entire mystery like he did was Enya. Where is Sigmar? Jake asked solemnly. This was the most important question. If the ghost hadn't been led astray, Sigmar hadn't been on Yotai Shuren 3 for a long time. If his theory was right, this one was like them, one of the Titan Pearl passengers. As for Isbius, she was undoubtedly the sworn enemy who wanted him dead for a long time. Think, Jake, think. He repeated to himself while replaying in memory all the data recorded by his senses and his bracelet since the beginning of this ordeal. Then suddenly, his mind froze as he focused on the image of two individuals. His first two encounters on the Titan Pearl. Gee, how did we miss something like this? Jake closed his eyes and massaged his temples to soothe his brain. An unspeakable anger was slowly rising in him. In response, he only heard She's dispirited sigh. There's nothing you could have done. They are at a level where they can influence your behavior and decisions without you realizing it. The Oracle system's malfunction is probably their fault, too. So why am I only realizing this now? Several possibilities. The evolution of your fluid core and spirit body made this possible. The effect is time-limited or has been lifted, or the last possibility is mild hypnosis. In the last case, if you are confronted with the obvious, then the illusion disappears. I see. Sigmar does not inform us of his movements, but he regularly gives us orders. We can also contact him if necessary. Ilphora put an end to his train of thought as she answered his previous question. F.U.C.K. Obviously, it couldn't be that simple. Jake ranted inwardly, but his face remained unfazed before the audience. I want to meet him, Jake proclaimed with resolve. Avi and the Inquisitor exchanged a meaningful look. Then Ilphora bowed respectfully and said, As you wish. I can arrange the meeting today if you so desire. Fine, but I won't meet with him today. Schedule it in 3 days. Jake declined straight away. Ilphora paused briefly, then bowed again. It will be done as you wish. Avi, we're leaving. You go ahead. I want to stay here and catch up with my friends. The Inquisitor gave her another baleful look, then left the hall without any escort. Drastin wanted to walk her out to keep an eye on her, but somehow Ilphora stepped through the large door and wall as if they didn't exist. Unlike a fluid ghost or Ostrexera's ectoplasmic state, her body seemed to behave more like a hologram. Either she had never been there in the first place, or like Kroyern and Oxium, her body was attuned to a specific element. Regardless, if Drastin was too clumsy to follow her, this was not so for Hephis, who slipped easily through the gaps in the door with his shadow form. He came back a few minutes later and confirmed that Ilphora had really left. Phew, it feels good to get some air at last. Avi instantly regained her easygoing cheerfulness as soon as the fluid master failure left the scene. These Inquisitors give me the creeps. I know I couldn't have kept the village without them, but now that they're here, I don't have much authority either. I'm just a puppet they're protecting because my identity has more value alive than it does dead. The Titan Pearl General then told them about her background as an heiress in the Shanman clan. The Shanman clan was one of the most influential families of the Third Brotherhood and produced the most powerful fluid wielders in Riva. At their peak, they even had a fluid grandmaster on the Consortium Council. About 140 years ago, they lost their only fluid grandmaster in a mysterious event. He became a wanted criminal overnight. It was also at this time that their home planet Riva began to decline. Coincidence or not, fate had a way of doing things. This fluid grandmaster from Riva was the same Sigmar Elsinire who had taken refuge on Yotai Shurin III over a century earlier. When the consortium announced the discovery of a habitable exoplanet not too far from Riva, the Third Brotherhood saw the perfect opportunity for a new beginning. Hence the 22 space expeditions that ensued to colonize Riva II. Thanks to her clan, Avi had been propelled to the helm of the Titan Pearl despite her young age and inexperience. But because she was neither the main heir nor her clan's prodigy, and far too young at the time, it was not until now that a space expedition to Riva II was entrusted to her. In retrospect, this was probably what saved her life. The tragic fate of Riva and its inhabitants seemed closely tied to that of Sigmar and her clan. Now Jake and the others were well aware of what had happened to those earlier expeditions. Sabotage from the inside. They had all been intercepted by Yotai Shurin III, now forming a graveyard of space.I.P.S around the station. Emowen's pirate ship was just collateral damage. They had never been the target of this conspiracy. While everyone considered Sigmar to be the mastermind behind the whole scheme, his presence aboard the Titan Pearl indicated that things were more complicated than they first assumed. Perhaps out of filial instinct or mere guilt, he had deemed it best to wrap things up once and for all. Why? Did you want 3 more days before meeting him? Essia asked curiously. To train and prepare. Jake answered honestly. If you have fluid to spend, now is the time. Because if you don't use it now, you never will. His near death at the hands of Isbius was still fresh in his mind. With his newfound resolve, Jake found that his previous main mission had been replaced by the extra mission, discover the ultimate truth. As before, there was no time limit. After the Fluid Ghost's report, Jake already knew that this ultimate truth was not going to be pretty. Because Sigmar and Wendy, the chief researcher of the station back then, had conceived a son. If this person was still alive, he would have been 137 years old. Alas, this was simply not possible, because someone had made sure that this would never happen. Sigmar, his father, had murdered him with his own hands. Chapter 455 Jackpot. Jake left the other Masons under Paveo to rebuild the other important structures in the village. After completing the castle, the only structures he personally rebuilt for most of the morning were those of his faction members. Except this time, he made sure that these structures were included in the inner wall of his own residence. Except for Ostrexera and Paveo's squad, whom he still didn't fully trust, all his allies now shared the same fortress. When the construction was completed, Jake exchanged a few small talk with his friends, but still couldn't relax. He listened to Will's expansion plans based on the monopoly of resources. With the assistance of Avi's village, he was confident he could accumulate a lot of fluid in no time. Of course, there was one caveat. Survive until all resource-producing villagers and NPCs had been eliminated or turned into monsters. Jake agreed in principle, but he no longer believed in this solution. Instead, he suggested something else that suited him better under the current circumstances. Do either of you have a jackpot card? He asked out of the blue. He was glad he had retrieved it and not just left it in the hands of the lucky villager who had drawn it. I have one in my possession. If you are willing to entrust all of your fluid to me, I intend to use it now. Will flinched as he heard him propose such a simple and pragmatic plan to implement. The businessman had obviously considered this option, but he hoped to reserve it for a time when his fortune would be more substantial. On the other hand, he had not yet succeeded in obtaining one of these cards despite his best efforts. Scour had one, though. Still, if they pooled their fluid, they could indeed get a colossal fortune in the snap of a finger. That's a good plan, Jake. But why didn't you mention that you had such a great card before? Will Ed with a tinge of resentment. Like you, I wasn't planning on using it so soon. Jake replied bitterly. I'm losing my marbles, Will. I need that fluid now, or I'm going to go ballistic any minute. I swear you don't want to be around me when that happens. The businessman suppressed an uncontrolled goosebump as he listened to his warning. He was taking this matter very seriously. Suddenly realizing the urgency, he examined the faces of each of his allies and noticed for the first time the numerous changes. The two sisters seemed composed, but they were fidgety and had abandoned their mannerisms. Tim had always been restless, but now he spent most of his time sharpening his axe. Drastin had already nearly gone crazy, as had Kawani and Svara, who were already close to their limits. Avi, was already known for her wild temperament long before visiting this station. Only Carmen seemed to be acting like herself, but Jake had already told him to watch out for her. Hephi's was the exception, but given his history as an assassin, it was best to consider him a ticking time bomb as well. Okay, I'm in. Should we tell Paveo and his men about this? Will suggested without much enthusiasm. No. Jake refused adamantly. I believe them when they claim to be on our side, but that just means they fear the monsters more than us. If they find out how much fluid we have, the corruption will stimulate their greed in unpredictable ways. Why trust me in that case? Avi asked, moved by his faith in her. I don't. Jake trampled on her goodwill toward him. But I have nothing to fear from you. No offense, but your character is easy to peg. HMF. The petite fluid knight drew her sword, ready for battle. I have 2 jackpot cards and 3 lottery cards. Tim interrupted them, ruining the young woman's fighting stance. Obviously, he had waited all this time to bring more punch to his revelation. His smug face said it all. The child's legendary luck had struck again. Drastin and Hephi's were shocked, but for the others it was a normal occurrence. Still, they didn't forget to rub his fragile ego the right way. Well done, Tim. Jake and Will patted him one after the other. Even Inya and Essia gave him a hug to congratulate him. All right, that's 3 jackpot cards. We can start. Jake put an end to the teenager's crowning moment, which seemed to be far too self-indulgent as his head was smothered by the 2 sisters' BRESDS. He seemed to be recovering well from Lily's absence. Although, to be honest, it was a bit early for the 12-year-old girl to accomplish the same feat, it was important not to let the teenager get a big head, though, because they still needed him. Jake then collected the jackpot cards and fluid from his allies, for a total of 3 jackpot cards, 3 lottery cards, and 1.437 billion units, and gave the entire amount back to Tim. Although he trusted the boy, he forced him to sign a contract in front of everyone to avoid any misunderstanding. The second largest contributor, contrary to what one might have guessed, was not Will, but Hephi's, followed closely by the 2 sisters. The assassin had accepted many contracts and had never devalued his rates. As for the 2 sisters, their noble role ensured them continuous income without putting in any effort. Go ahead, Tim, you can start. Jake gently encouraged him. This was the moment of truth. No matter how hard he tried not to stress the child, his jitteriness and that of the others in the group showed through. Depending on Tim's luck, this sum could be multiplied by 2 to 5 times per jackpot card. With such a large payout, the margin was simply exorbitant. Much to everyone's pleasant surprise, Tim shared the interface of his fluid card with them through his bracelet. It was not to gain their trust, but more to share with them a special moment. Winning money was always fun. First jackpot card used. Your initial fortune of 1.757B becomes 5.642B. Second jackpot card used. Your initial fortune of 5.642B becomes 18.958B. Third jackpot card used. Your original fortune of 18.958B becomes 90 for 13B. Dead silence. Everyone stared at the interface result, completely speechless. What kind of FUCKNG divine luck was that? Dumbfounded, Will pinched Drastin next to him and widened his eyes as he heard him squeal in pain. As for Inya and Essia, they hugged the child again, determined to hold on so tightly that his luck would rub off on them. The village, the forest, the sky, the sun, everything vanished, replaced by a sickening bellowing sound. As the group's eyesight acclimated to the new lighting, they found that they were all in a large, empty hangar. The metal floor and walls, the pipes snaking along the ceiling like gigantic earthworms. They were back in the station. At the back of the hangar, they could even make out an elevator like the one that had brought them here. What the hell? Then the light came back. The village, the forest, the sky, the sun, everything returned to normal. The cold, austere space station looked like a bad memory. Yet everyone noticed that the runes lining the ground were a bit dimmer than before. It was weird. Drastin grunted as he hugged his club a little too tightly. Since he had broken his war hammer, it had become his replacement weapon. The others wore pensive expressions. It felt like a power outage. Holding his chin, Jake remembered the distance, and counting his steps, he walked to where he thought he had seen the elevator. Unfortunately, it was just too good to be true. There he found nothing special except the ruins of an old house. This was supposed to be the place. Hephi's vouched as he pointed to the ashes of an old fireplace. Old ghost, was that your plan to get out of here? Jake questioned the deceased fluid wielder. No, this is a surprise for me too. He hastened to admit while popping his head out of Jake's body. The plan I have is much more dangerous and pragmatic, but it will work for sure. At least now we know we weren't transported somewhere else. Carmen commented indifferently. Despite her apparent calmness, a tumult of emotions was brewing behind her beautiful eyes. With their fluid prize secured, Jake then redistributed the fluid according to each person's needs and the amount of fluid provided at the start. He was going to need a lot of fluid, but he wasn't the only one. His allies also needed to become stronger to withstand the corruption and the coming battle. Even so, it was pointless to give them too much. Tim's jackpot cards had surpassed his expectations, and because of that, even he wasn't sure he could spend that much fluid in such a short time, even if he wanted to. Now that they had more fluid than they could spend, Jake could finally train without restriction. After giving some instructions, he secluded himself in a castle room and grabbed his fluid card. It was time to become a true fluid wielder. Chapter 456 Fluid Master. In another village, well to the east of Jake and his companions, two hooded individuals emerged from the shadows. The sun was about to set again, and their appearance went unnoticed. Except for one person. Inquisitors, to what do we owe the honor of your humble visit? A striking Eskimo-looking woman took aim at them with the scepter in her hands. The object was carved from a human femur and ended with a tiny human baby skull stuffed into the mouth of a carved snake. If Jake had been present, he would have recognized the scepter the fluid ghost had reported seeing tattooed on his murderer's arm, except that here it was no longer a tattoo, but a genuine one. The woman was still young, with a malignant look and a pierced nose, while an ugly scar scarred her lower lip all the way down her chin. Her curves and charms were hidden under the multiple layers of fur covering her. It was as if she was gearing up for another ice age. Anyone else would have sweated profusely in her place. Tatega, you know why we're here. One of the inquisitors growled menacingly. This one was particularly tall and muscular compared to his peers. Unlike the other inquisitors, his body filled out his cloak. Unlike Oxium and Ilphora, his body was very much alive. Who would have thought Isbius would send the great Kagarum himself? Tatega jeered without getting daunted. Is it Keelet you seek? Follow me. The Inuit woman nimbly led them to a shack away from the decaying village. In this village, there were no more lords, but some buildings had been preserved. The hut she stopped at was dingy, as if the wood in it was rotten and moth-eaten. Maggots swarmed everywhere, seeping into every pore of the decaying wood. But Tatega showed no disgust as she banged on the door. Knock, knock. Keelet, you have a visitor. She barked tersely before stopping the two inquisitors as she pressed her scepter against the first 1 foot SCHSD. Remember, at the slightest sign, the truce is broken. Enter. Once inside, they were greeted by a subdued atmosphere whose only light was derived from the multiple candles laying on the floor. A smell of dried blood and fresh meat filled the place. As they passed through the door, a cracking sound was heard under their feet, and they discovered small bones crushed under their soles. Looking around, they found that the floor was littered with skeletal remains. The one they were looking for was sitting cross-legged in the center of the room in the middle of a pentagram painted with animal blood. In contrast to Tatega, he was shirtless and wearing only his pants and fur boots. His head was shaved on the sides, and his long hair on top was pulled back and tied in a knot. With eyes closed, he was knitting something vaguely humanoid, fiddling with a thick, whitish yarn of dubious origin. The two inquisitors waited patiently for him to finish his craft. Then at last, seeming to notice their presence, Keelet opened his eyes and smiled. His white eyes had no irises and evoked an unspeakable wickedness. How is Grandmaster Isbius? He asked politely. Is she still dreaming of dominating the universe? Is the consortium not enough for her anymore? Kagarum slammed his fist into the worm-eaten door, and it imploded on the spot. Don't play with me. Isbius tolerates you because you are useful. Keep it that way. Keelet raised an eyebrow, but kept his sardonic smile. Very well. What do you want? Who is the poor fool I have to curse? I prefer that. Kagarum grunted. The Inquisitor nodded to his comrade, and the latter lifted his hand to materialize a mini transparent barrier. On it, traces of blood and fresh brains were spread out. Faced with such a sample, Heelit's eyes widened with surprise. Despite his apparent calm, he was undoubtedly excited. "I understand better why you came to see me." The Eskimo player burst out laughing, then bit his lower lip to the blood to curb his rapture. "If this guy is still alive after blowing his brains out, I guess he's worth my time. He'll make an excellent guinea pig." "We don't want a guinea pig. We want him dead," Kagarim reminded him coldly. Ignoring the threat, Heelit ran his finger over the barrier and thoughtfully chewed the piece of brain he had picked up on it. Contemplating something, he promised, "He will die, but remember, I am not infallible. My curses have many restrictions." "We know that," the Inquisitor said. "I don't trust your otherworldly magic, but Isbius seems to hold it in high regard." "Last question?" Heelit queried with earnest curiosity. "Why don't you kill him yourself? By the looks of it, you've already succeeded once." Kagarim fathomed the Eskimo's white eyes ominously before retorting, "You know why." "I see. The curse will be in effect tomorrow morning. How long he survives once it is activated will depend on his abilities. But either way, I doubt he'll have any time to spare after that." "Perfect. That's what we want." Kagarim patted his shoulder twice, and the Eskimo's knees almost buckled. The two Inquisitors were then escorted to the entrance of the village by Tatega and two other Inuit armed with spears. From beginning to end, the Inquisitor accompanying Kagarim spoke no words, but when it snapped its fingers once out of sight, a veil of dark energy enveloped them, and they vanished. "How do I do it?" Jake appealed to the old ghost's knowledge to break through the fluid master threshold. "I've never reached that level in my life, but it shouldn't be too different from fluid adept," the fluid ghost confessed. "Merge your consciousness with your fluid core and tap into your fluid card to absorb the fluid. It gets tougher once you reach the status of fluid master. Epiphanies and insights are needed, and I don't know if the fluid in this card has that potential. Usually one must connect to the fluid fabric tying the entire universe together and listen until an enlightenment, a profound change in the soul occurs. The precognition, the innate fluid mastery of the fluid wielders comes from the infinite knowledge and data contained in the meandering fluid. No one knows what they will find and what ability they will acquire until they have their epiphany. The current consensus is that our D point, E point, S point, I point, R point, ES greatly influence this transformation." Jake suppressed a grunt. "I don't know if this pure fluid has all this knowledge and information to offer, but I doubt it." He sighed. "We'll figure it out as we go along." From a fragile stream, a tumultuous river of fluid soon gushed forth, and all that fluid poured with unparalleled violence into his fluid core, which compared to this was a tiny, insignificant organ. It didn't take long for his apricot kernel-sized fluid core to slowly start growing again. He was already close to the level of a peak fluid adept, and it only took a little push to break through this barrier. Still, there was a reason why this hurdle stopped 90% of the fluid wielders. Since a fluid adept had a nearly human body, he had to feed his fluid core gradually and could only boost his organs by mobilizing the fluid under his control, an ability that depended heavily on their mental strength. This was extremely grueling and required long recovery breaks. With his Murtharian body, spirit body, and new true will point, Jake overcame all these pitfalls. His fluid core, infused with a flood of fluid, soon reached its full capacity and began to crack. Already familiar with the incident, Jake mobilized his bloodline, constitution, and vitality ether to contain the damage. 2 hours later, after his fluid core had fractured and then regenerated a couple hundred times, the organ became completely opaque, like a black hole, and stopped absorbing energy. A few seconds later, the fluid core began to gobble up fluid again, this time several million units in a heartbeat. The stagnant organ the size of an apricot pit suddenly doubled in size, and Jake's mind experienced a massive expansion of his senses. His perception of the world was heightened, amplified many times over, and at that moment, all sorts of information entered his brain. The fluid running through his meridians and feeding his cells formed a deep connection for the first time, and a kind of link with his ether code was established. With this new knowledge, Jake immediately knew how to use the fluid to strengthen his body. Opening his eyes, The membrane of his cells began to vibrate, swelling and deflating at a very high frequency, as if they had finally learned to breathe, and the fluid and ether clumped around it was finally allowed in. As his cells vibrated faster and faster, they suddenly began to rub against each other, and this friction quickly raised his body temperature to several thousand degrees. The ether and the fluid within it subtly changed its nature, and a mysterious and irreversible transformation took place within him. Chapter 457 Power-Up. An unknown number of hours later, the fluid and ether intake suddenly slowed down before coming to a complete standstill a few minutes later. His cells had finally reached saturation point. However, they did not stop vibrating and grinding against each other. In time, and if Jake wished, the surrounding fluid and ether would continue to seep into his cells and feed them, converted into usable energy by some cryptic process. When Jake opened his eyes, the first thing he did was check the date, then his oracle status. 2 days had passed since his seclusion began. He immediately realized the profound changes that had taken place within him. His body felt as light as a feather, and his mind was so clear that he literally wondered if he had not spent his entire existence on morphine. His spirit body's alertness and responsiveness, and many of his powers such as his heat and earth control, had improved significantly. Contrary to what Jake had imagined, he was baffled to learn that his ether and body stats hadn't improved all that much, although their values were slowly but surely increasing without him having to do anything. This was attributable to the immense energy stored in his cells that had not yet been fully processed. Right now, his body was the reservoir of several million fluid units. His fluid master core alone contained nearly 5 M units, while these cells held an additional million. Most surprisingly, his cells also seemed capable of storing ether. He now had another option for spending all his ether points. His cells were unable to metabolize all that energy in a short period of time, but thanks to the epiphany he had just experienced, he knew exactly how to make use of that excess energy. By channeling this fluid with the help of his fluid master core, he was able to increase his physical, spiritual, and bloodline abilities to an unprecedented level of precision and creativity. However, with no way to absorb the fluid and corrupted ether externally, he had no choice but to deplete his own reserves to accomplish these feats. Charging his fluid master core and cells to full capacity had taken him over 2 days. Once in combat, he would have no opportunity to replenish himself and would have to use these boosted skills sparingly. However, there was something far more extraordinary that had changed in him. His silver Murtharian bloodline had evolved once again. He estimated that it would have taken him at least another year of training in a high-temperature environment, but the breakthrough when he was promoted to Fluid Master had changed all that. According to him, this had to do with the new autonomous behavior of his cells. If he had followed the normal path, making his cells breathe, vibrate, and rub together would have required outstanding body control and perception stats, probably in the order of 10 to 100 times greater, and it would have required a lot of training to control them in unison. The insight contained within the fluid had turned the tables, allowing him to take a phenomenal shortcut. When Jake read his new bloodline's characteristics, he froze in place. Silver Murtharian body LVL3, the robustness of a Cantharian, combined with the intellect of an Altarian, the fighting instinct of a Myrmidian, and something more. The physical and brain abilities are 8 times, 4 times at LVL2, as good as a normal human, but without the limitations. Your digestive abilities allow you to digest almost anything in a short time. Your cells can now passively store, purify, and absorb ambient energy, including heat, radiation, and ether, to gradually strengthen themselves or reuse it later. No. At each additional level, the physical and mental abilities will be doubled, as well as the speed of progression, tolerance to heat, pressure, and radiation. Silver Murtharian Spirit Body LVL3. The Altarian Spirit Body solidifies the spirit body and strengthens the Cantharian ether skills by adding telekinesis. The spirit body of a Murtharian is 12 times greater, 6 times at LVL2, than that of a normal human, and has a natural instinct conferring a form of precognition. The spirit body can also passively absorb a small amount of ambient energy, including heat, radiation, and ether, to strengthen itself. No. These faculties double at every level. Silver Mertherian Soul LVL3. Fire, Earth, Metal, and Light, Radiation. Attribute, Slight Fire, Earth, and Light Attribute at LVL2. Able to feed on the ether contained in heat, earth, metal, or radiation to survive and strengthen itself. Ether Bloodline Skills. Accelerated Silver Mertherian LVL3 growth. Closely related to positivity, determination, pride, fighting, and anger. The effect doubles with each level. Accelerated Silver Mertherian LVL1 decline. LVL2 at LVL2 closely related to negativity, shame, weakness of mind, fear, and feelings of defeat and failure. The effect doubles with each level. Self-encoding. There are no longer any limits to the ether stats, as the ether is constantly being compressed to make room. However, the cost in ether required to increase stats will quickly become exponential. Using the ether encoded by the Oracle device to increase the ether stats is no longer recommended if the encoding level doesn't match. Ether and Soul Tribute. A defeated enemy will surrender a fraction of his ether and soul to the bloodline holder. It is no longer proportional to the threat level. Warrior's Silver Mertherian Trance LVL3. As a result of the above-mentioned emotions and the will to vanquish in battle, the body stats will be temporarily increased by 200-400%, 100-200% at LVL2. The effect doubles with each level. Spiritual Silver Mertherian Eyes LVL3. It becomes possible upon activation to analyze one's opponents to understand their physical, mental, and etheric weaknesses. Passively, it is possible to see ether and other supernatural elements at a certain distance without going through the extrasensory perception of the spirit body. The eye is now able to harness and channel the power of spirit body and soul spells, as well as weak ether skills. New. With each additional level, it will be possible to obtain more information. Silverstone Skin LVL3. The body can withstand high temperatures and radiation, including high pressure and friction. The skin can alternate between a rocky or metallic state as desired, and its thickness can also be modulated to form different appendages or weapons. New. Heat and Radiation Tolerance LVL3. The body temperature is no longer fixed at 37 degrees Celsius and can withstand a much higher internal temperature without shutting down. Earth and Steel Manipulation LVL3. Including all the minerals, metals, atoms, and inorganic traces found in the soil of Kinther's home planet, which is a small volcanic telluric planet very close to its sun. At LVL3 you can now bend rocks, boulders, and steel to your will. The delicacy of control and perception doubles at every level. Heat and Radiation Control LVL3. It becomes possible to thermally and energetically excite any object, including one's own body. At LVL3, you can now perform intermediate heat and radiation manipulation. The finesse of control and perception doubles at every level. Telekinesis LVL3. It becomes possible to control objects remotely via the spirit body. At spirit body and physical body equivalent, it is only possible to exert 200%, 100% at LVL2 of the physical body strength. Control is not limited to simple actions anymore. The effect doubles at each level. Accelerated Healing LVL3. It is possible to heal even the most lethal and disabling wounds by burying oneself underground in a warm space. At LVL3, the passive regeneration ability operates without any need to bury oneself. This passive recovery can now regenerate limbs and is no longer discounted. Dependent on the environment, the body's tolerance to heat, radiation, and the quality of the soil. Spirit of Revenge. After a defeat, and if the host's will has not wavered, the bloodline will be greatly stimulated. First, his grade 8 bloodline had finally ranked up to grade 9. Jake still didn't know what defined the grade of a bloodline, but he hadn't yet encountered any bloodline above grade 8, the only exception being Tim's Biskirian bloodline, which was already at grade 8 despite being only 20% pure. But what justified grade 9 in his opinion was the drastic changes in the bloodline skills. Ether and Soul Tribute, as well as accelerated Silver Mertherian decline. For starters, all of his Mertherian skills were now stamped with silver, which was not the case before. But most importantly, Getting a fixed fraction of any enemy's ether and soul meant that he could now slaughter absolutely anything to raise his ether stats. He no longer had to limit himself to worthy opponents. As for decline, it was even more shocking that the skill had actually regressed. He was now less penalized by his negative emotions, while the benefit of a positive mindset had been doubled again. This time, though, Jake also felt that his bloodline had almost reached its limit. It was an instinct that stemmed from his gut, and he was pretty sure that the cap on his Silver Murtharian bloodline was level 4. After familiarizing himself with the changes, Jake tested all his skills one by one to gauge the difference. The results proved to be beyond satisfying. By the time he finished running his tests, the room he was in had completely melted. Just as Jake was about to rebuild everything to challenge his brand new Earth control, someone knocked on his door. Scanning the intruder with his mind, he recognized Carmen. Chapter 458, The Curse. Jake, I didn't want to disturb your training, but we've got a problem, she piped up unexpectedly as he was about to invite the vampire in. What's the matter? Jake asked, assuming that something had happened to the village during his seclusion. Someone placed a curse on you, she said gravely. But you're fine for now, she added immediately afterwards to reassure him. Skeptical, Jake inspected the various health parameters listed in his oracle status without finding anything detrimental. It was only when he got down to the bottom that he found the mention cursed. Scanning his body with his mind's eye, he discovered a foreign force in addition to the fluid and ether trying to encroach on his cells. Because his cells were already saturated with energy, the curse was stuck on the outside and could not harm him. Or was it for another reason? For the moment, this disruptive energy was in minority, but with each passing second it would assimilate a new fluid or ether strand, as well as a fraction of his body heat and electrical energy, leading to a rapid build-up of its potency. Jake made some quick calculations in his head and concluded that a normal human would have died within minutes from a heart attack due to arrhythmia, and if he persevered any longer, from hypothermia or brain arrest, when the ether forming his proto-soul or soul would have drained off. In his case, it would take longer than that, but once the curse entered his cells it would be all the same. The curse growing exponentially, he would have lasted a day at the most before collapsing. Jake remembered the guy with the shaman's role that Tim had mentioned, but he refrained from jumping to any conclusions. The only other person who might know something about curses was Ostrexra. After all, it was just like a ghost to haunt a house and curse its inhabitants. Do you know how I can get rid of it? Jake asked calmly. After all he'd been through in the last few months, he was not easily impressed. Yes and no, she confessed sincerely. If this had happened a week ago, I would have been very worried, but the situation has changed. Keeping your cells saturated with fluid should keep you safe for at least a week. Having already completed your main mission, you just have to do your best during that time until the Oracle cleanses you. That's not a solution, Jake grouched. How does the Oracle purge these curses? It depends on where they come from. If they come from evil spirits, soul and spirit attacks might be enough. If they work like a harmful computer worm feeding on its host, we can only try to force them out or make them think they've achieved their goal. You mean I need to die? Jake ridiculed. Let's try to eliminate it first instead. How do I do that? Most curses use a medium that binds them to the target person, she patiently explained. It could be a blood sample, a hair sample, or a personal object. Just as you establish a servant contract with the help of the Oracle system, a curse is also a kind of contract formed with ether, except that it is done against your will. The person uses inert, non-sentient remains of you to replicate your etheric signature. You know that ether and fluid are not fundamentally different. When a connection or contract is made, it exists across time and space. Even if beyond a certain distance the curse or contract loses its effectiveness, it still exists, like a decree or law. One can easily disobey a law and hope not to get caught, but invalidating it is much more complicated. Jake became more and more disconcerted the longer she spoke. The mechanism behind these curses seemed extremely abstruse, but also hinted at some concerning flaws in the Oracle system. Does this mean that one of these curse makers could theoretically make me sign a slave contract against my will? If they have a willing sample of your soul, yes. You'd feel it though if they did. Also, this is extremely advanced ether science. The player who cursed you must depend on an ether skill or bloodline to perform these feats, and there are probably many limitations. In this case, it can only affect your body, even though the loss of ether will eventually impact your spirit body and then your soul. You still haven't told me how the oracle cleanses these curses, Jake quipped with a twinge of annoyance. I'm getting to that. As with every ether skill, its effectiveness varies depending on the user. Curses are considered more like soul or ether spells, and therefore the intervention of the caster's spirit body is always required. So if the mental power of the curse breaker far outweighs that of the curse caster, lifting the curse is actually pretty simple. Another solution is to change one foot's etheric or genetic signature enough so that the curse no longer recognizes its target. There are also specific purification magics, but they don't always work and depend on the attribute or element of the curse used. It's worth a try. Jake shrugged. First, he activated bloodline ignition and his cells to raise his temperature, and he instantly became a human torch. Scanning the foreign energy in his cells, he saw it shrivel in a corner, but it didn't dissipate. Instead, it went on absorbing his body heat at the same rate as before. Massive amounts of heat don't work. Next test. Jake made a mental note. From a human torch, he then manipulated his tremendous energy to become a lamp man. An intense white light flashed from his body, so blinding that it felt like a bolt of lightning had just struck the room. Again, the murky energy remained unaffected. Like ether or fluid, it seemed completely impervious to physical phenomena. The first two were nonetheless manipulable, and Jake then tried to take control of it with his spirit body. This failed miserably. It was like using a sieve to catch sand. The curse motionlessly ignored all his efforts. Neither his extrasensory perception nor his spirit body control were sufficient to provide the precision required for such manipulation. As he was about to give up, one last thought struck him. Spiritual silver Mertherian eyes on. His vision changed, and the cursed energy appeared clearly before his eyes. At that very moment, it was the only weakness in his own body. He still didn't know how to use proper offensive soul spells, but with this skill he could try something. The golden glyph, Apex Predator, suddenly sprouted behind his galactic irises, and he condensed all his mental strength and radiation soul attribute into them. His star-like eyes began to glow, and a laser beam invisible to the naked eye shot out from them. The curse disintegrated instantly. Jake was stunned for a moment, unable to comprehend how simple it had been. From She's dumbfounded silence, she shared his astonishment. Knock, knock. Hearing the commotion inside, Carmen realized that Jake was well aware of her arrival, and she began to pound on the door mercilessly. In reality, he hadn't kept her waiting that long. With his brain speed, his discussions with she rarely lasted more than a few seconds. TSK. So annoying. Jake choked back a profanity as he heard her racket while, with a wave of his hand, opened the huge door wings with his telekinesis. A pouting Carmen, arms akimbo, appeared on the other side of the door. Her bewitching face had shed its coldness, replaced by a much more human expression. Dusting off her dress, she walked with dignity inside. The hall was still warm, but Jake had already erased most of the traces of his experiments. The room where he had tested his skills would remain out of use for a while, though. Why did you make me wait so long? She shamelessly sat down in one of the stone chairs before freezing as she sank her head at him. Who are you? Jake was taken aback by this question. Not noticing any drastic changes in his stats, height, or weight, he hadn't even bothered to look in the mirror. After all, he was used to seeing them increase. I forgot to tell you, she murmured embarrassedly. Fearing the worst, Jake turned pale and hurried to conjure a decent mirror with his powers. When he saw his reflection, he also froze, but for a different reason than he had imagined. Sure, he was over 2m50, but being over 2m wasn't uncommon among the players. Even Carmen was almost 6 feet tall. What was most pleasing was that although his weight and stats had increased, his exaggerated musculature and beastly Cantharian features had begun to recede. The process had already begun when he became a silver Mertherian, but his skin was now quite fair and looked just right. No longer thick and hard like cowhide, but healthily tanned. His hair and irises were now completely silver, with a glint of gold. His jaw and fangs were also no longer as prominent. Paradoxically, one might have thought that he had become weaker, but this was not so. With his Silverstone skin skill LVL3, He could modulate these external parameters at will. Ahem, why do you want to see me? Jake covered his awkwardness by tackling the pesky issue head-on. Carmen kept staring at him with wide-eyed interest for a few seconds before remembering she was here for a reason. Her amazement gave way to grief, and her mouth opened and closed repeatedly with indecision, as if she was still horror-stricken by the request she was about to make. It was only then that Jake noticed the dried red marks under her eyes. At long last, she took the plunge. Help me kill someone. Chapter 459 Intelligence Gathering. A few hours later, Jake and Carmen were patiently waiting for something, perched together on the highest branch of a yew tree. Scanning the horizon, the silver Murtharian man made another check. Are you sure about what you saw? Clenching her fists tensely, then loosening them again, the young woman nodded with a dejected face. 100% sure. Wyatt has gone nuts. She insisted, biting her lip in frustration. If there's still hope, can you try to spare him? Watching her distraught expression, Jake sighed. Earlier, she had asked him to help her kill Wyatt Griffiths, the leader of her own faction. It must have taken a lot for her to come to that decision, but it was obvious that this was not what she wanted. If he hadn't committed an unforgivable act, she would never have made such a resolution. It was obvious from her smitten expression that she held more than just admiration for this Wyatt. I just promised to come and judge the situation in person, not do your dirty work. Jake said flippantly, refusing to give her any false hope. Whatever you think you saw, we need more information. I remind you that we're scheduled to meet with Sigmar in a few hours. The Inquisitor named Ulfora had come by again early this morning after Carmen's visit, and the time of the meeting with her leader had been set for late afternoon. During the past 3 days, Will had done a phenomenal job. To be exact, it was Peter Brady to whom they owed a good part of their achievements. The drug addict had sneaked into all the villages after fleeing the onslaught of Isbius monsters a few days earlier. With a knack for infiltration, he had managed to gain acceptance as a citizen in most of them, allowing him to apply his village idiot talent to all their inhabitants. Thus, he had identified the roles of most remaining participants without drawing attention to himself. Regretfully, while trying to reach Isbius village, he had hit a snag. Avros had instantly recognized him, and it was a godsend that he hadn't been killed. To escape, he had been driven into the forest without having the proper role, which had landed him back in the pit for the 3rd time. This had, against all odds, saved his life, but this time he had lost some feathers. When Will had found him this morning, the drug-addicted player was on the verge of death, with only his head, his torso, and part of his right thigh intact. His body was completely charred and covered with foul-smelling pustules. The only reason he was still alive was because joining Jake's faction, the Murtharian body passive had made him much more resilient. Still, he was pretty much screwed. The thing is, when Jake's bloodline had been promoted to LVL3, the bonus of this passive skill had also been upgraded accordingly. The body stats of the Murtharian Nerds members were now boosted by 160%, 20% of 8 times the body stats of a human, compared to those of a normal human, and Jake also benefited from this bonus. Whether it was a twist of fate or a mere coincidence, it was precisely the increase in this bonus that saved Peter's life. It also goes without saying that the other members were more than delighted by this improvement, especially the physically weaker ones like Will and Aaron, who felt like they had been granted a second life. Most had lost their minds and joined a criminal settlement, but the others had enthusiastically accepted Will's invitation upon learning that Jake and his group had successfully resisted and eliminated the combined attack of monsters and inquisitors. To these helpless and desperate natives and players, the heroic deeds of Jake, Drastin, and Vincent were the stuff of legend. As a result, thanks to Will's supervisory efforts, their village had been mostly rebuilt and now numbered 600 villagers. Based on Peter's report, the total number of natives and players alike still alive was estimated at 5,000. Over the past few days, the chaos had been total, and the most obscene crimes had taken place under the corruption's influence. For most of the remaining survivors, all that was missing was a spark for their consciousness to flare up in a bloodbath. The final battle was near. After all the skirmishes and bloodshed, only 5 heavyweights remained, arrogantly imposing themselves on the competition. The village of Isbius, which consisted entirely of more than 1,500 monsters, not counting the guards. The village of Sigmar and Avi, with over 1,000 natives and a few rare players. A village of criminals led by Boris Slominsky and his faction, the Pagans, to which the deceased Chinin belonged, and which included just under 300 villagers. Surprisingly, Ka was doing quite well there and had gained the trust of their leader. Wyatt Griffith's Monster Village and his Pure Blood faction, which Jake and Carmen were currently spying on from a treetop. According to their initial investigations, he had about 300 monsters under his command and many prisoners. And finally, Jake's village with about 600 villagers, most of whom were useless. There were still a few other villages such as that of the Aegean Mahanjal, the Inuit or Scour, but they were much smaller. And yet, they could not be underestimated because they were mostly made up of players. Heaven only knew with whom they had forged their alliances. Given the urgency of the situation, Drastin, Vincent, and the others had also stopped their training. Before Jake left with Carmen, everyone had been given their assignments. Drastin and Vincent would convince Boris through Kyle, while Inya and Essia would help Hephaes convince Mahanjal and Ralner. Being all Aegeans, this was the best solution. Everyone had made good use of the fluid obtained from the jackpot cards, and they had all become much stronger. Jake, something's going on. Carmen brazenly nudged him as he spotted some movement on the side of her former faction. At the moment, she was still one of their members, but was patently on the outs. Opening his eyes wide, he suppressed a yawn of boredom and focused on the newcomers. With his keen eyesight, he saw two unfamiliar inquisitors coming out of Wyatt Castle. As usual, it was impossible to tell them apart by their clothing, but the gait of these two was also indistinguishable from normal humans. However, their size was iconic, one being tall and sturdy like him, while the other was barely taller than the vampire at his side. With Peter's report, he identified them as Kagarim and Amiv. The drug addict had paid dearly to know their names. With his Murtharian sight, Jake focused his attention on their spirit-body-s fluctuations. These two were no amateurs. The fluid screen draping over them rendered their telepathic exchanges untraceable. I can't figure out what they're saying to each other. Jake apologized telepathically to Carmen, not without them realizing it anyway. Let's try to get closer to learn the truth from one of the villagers. The vampire suggested. I can try to question a member of my faction. I'm sure they haven't all gone mad. Jake rolled his eyes. It was clear from her crestfallen countenance that she herself did not believe her statement. Tracking the two inquisitors with his eyes, he was momentarily startled when he saw them teleport away, but he didn't dwell on it. Not just yet. He finally replied aloud. If this doesn't work, our cover will be blown. Let's wait a little longer. Suit yourself, she muttered, crossing her arms. The duo continued to watch the stubbornly empty village until two new inquisitors showed up at the far end of the street. At a glance, Jake knew it wasn't the same two inquisitors as before. He recognized one of them as the inquisitor from his first round. The problem was that Peter and Will's report did not mention them. What the hell is going on? Suspicious and with a bad feeling, he gritted his teeth and decided to sneak closer to the village. With Carmen on his heels, Jake shadowed them until the two inquisitors were invited into the same castle that Kagarim and Amiv had just left. A few minutes later, the two fluid masters emerged through the same door and left the premises at a high speed. Unlike the previous pair, they did not teleport away, giving them the opportunity to tag along. But Jake gave up on that idea. They weren't there for that. Almost immediately afterwards, the castle gates opened for the third time and a herd of people poured out. The mystery of where the villagers had gone was solved. Jake almost fell off his tree branch when he saw a familiar figure. Kevin, what the hell is he doing here? He exclaimed inwardly. His cousin was in his were-bear form and a bestial, cruel expression permeated his face. His brown fur had turned gray and was partially covered in dried blood, but he didn't seem to care. Something's wrong, Jake warned Carmen, finally sharing her concern. As if to further darken the picture, another recognizable figure emerged from the castle doorway. A long blonde mane, tan skin, and luscious looks. It could only be Sarah. Except that this Sarah had changed a lot. Her golden eyes had turned to an intense orange verging on red, and a carnivorous and sadistic smile accompanied her every move. She too was covered in blood. Chapter 460 Capture Mission. Jake was dying to yell at them to get their attention, but his common sense prevented him from doing so. His ACU'd up men was warning him that this reunion would not go as planned. If nothing else, they looked healthy. Staying low at the edge of the village, Jake followed Kevin's gaze and saw him heading for a warehouse the grocers had set up to store their goods. Will had also rebuilt a similar structure in their new village. He didn't see anything wrong with it at the time, but he got a nasty hunch when he saw Kevin licking his lips. Sarah and two other vampires with the same red eyes as Carmen were also walking in the same direction. As Kevin entered the warehouse, he felt Carmen clutch his arm. "Don't," she whispered pleadingly. Jake puzzled over the gleam of pain behind her pupils, but he didn't let empathy cloud his judgment. Jerking his clutched arm, he broke free of her grip. "Now I'm here, I need to know." He apologized grimly. Feeling his resolve, Carmen sighed ruefully, but made no further attempt to change his mind. After all, it was because of her that he was here. With growing coldness, Jake watched Kevin slip into the building, then heard the desperate cries inside. A few seconds later, a sharp scream of agony rang out, and then there was silence again except for a few sobs. A moment later, Jake saw his cousin come out covered in fresh blood munching on something. When he squinted, he identified the thing as a human forearm. When he realized this, his face paled in horror, but darkened right after. After observing the Zorian's man-eating practices, he didn't expect to witness such a scene again so soon. Quelling his disgust, his mind cleared of all its parasitic emotions, and he turned his attention back to Sarah and the other vampires on their way to the same building. When the blonde woman went in, his face was as smooth as a waveless sea. Yet, for those who knew him, this often heralded the calm before the storm. Far from being perfect, Jake had a recurring flaw long before he fell victim to the corruption. He could hold a grudge and was very principled. Nonsensical cannibalism was not something he could tolerate. Unsurprisingly, the terrified screams inside rose louder, interspersed with the uproarious laughter of the vampires in the room. A moment later, the screaming stopped and Sarah and the vampires accompanying her emerged with a satisfied grin, fresh blood still dripping from their lips. "Fuck, I'm going to kill them." Jake gritted his teeth in fury. The composure he had managed to keep in check all this time was about to shatter. If his grandfather Anthony had been present, he who was against punitive violence would probably have beaten his grandson Kevin to death himself. As for Sarah, she too needed someone to knock some sense into her head. Upon seeing him flare up so quickly, Carmen began to panic. Clutching his arm again to restrain him from attacking, she whispered nervously, "Not now, please. We didn't come for them. I want to kill Wyatt too, but not now." "Why do you think I want to kill him? I may be a vampire, but he's done something terrible to me too." Jake was about to ignore her plea in search of an opportunity to attack, when he felt a warm liquid running down his arm. Looking down, he saw tears of blood streaming profusely from the young woman's heartbroken face. His anger left him at once. The sight of her crying was like a cold shower, and he regained his composure. Taking deep breaths to normalize his mood, he replayed all the memories he had of Carmen's original faction, and he suddenly had a good idea of what had happened. "The little girl?" he blurted out, almost certain. The kid who had run into him had left an impression on him for the simple reason that her name was also Lily. Decidedly, this ordeal was not bringing luck to the bearers of this name. Carmen's uncontrolled shaking of rage gave him the confirmation he had been fearing. After weeping, the vampire regained some of her composure and nodded sadly. "My little sister." She confessed before telling him what she knew. "I knew she was eliminated early in the second round, but not how. When I found Wyatt and the others, the situation was already like that. Don't get me wrong, our vampire race is a slave to its bloodline. We really need human blood, or at least something close to it, to subsist. Legend has it that it came from a sacrifice made by one of our ancestors. In exchange for the power to protect our fellow man, we were condemned to drink their blood for eternity. Instead of showing up in the sunlight, respected and admired, we were forced to live in darkness, feared and abhorred by those we were supposed to protect. Over time, most vampires have forgotten the noble origin of their powers, but the original clans like mine still remember. We strive to consume only the blood we need to survive and multiply our sources so as not to endanger the lives of our prey. Unfortunately, not all new vampires share this view, and it is beginning to spread to some of the older clans. Power curses are some of the most powerful curses in existence, and are also passed on to offspring. Many powerful bloodlines also work like this, because it strengthens the spirit-ether connection. Jake compared her statements to the data from his own Murtharian bloodline, and had to admit that there was some truth to what she said. It was because his negative emotions were weakening him as much as his positive ones that he was able to progress so quickly. On the other hand, because his bloodline predisposed him to be overconfident, arrogant, and reckless, he was much more likely to make prejudicial mistakes. If one were to take the reasoning even further, he was gradually losing his former personality. Some would say that compared to the loser he once was, it was for the best, but was it really? What he did know for sure was that the old him was introverted and extremely distrustful by nature. Although he was not overly fearful, he was not proactive. No matter how powerful he was, the old him would never have taken the risk of putting himself in the spotlight as he was doing now. The old Jake would have gone unnoticed without provoking anything or anyone. For the sake of survival and competitiveness, he would have done his best, but never by compromising his safety. His past motto would have been something along the lines of, even if everyone else dies, I'll survive. Even if the corruption eventually drove him insane, it would have been his paranoid fear and distrust that would have gotten him killed. His recent actions completely invalidated that perspective. Instead, the current Jake, while still rational, was daredevil, proactive, and much easier to provoke. Inwardly, he still thought his life mattered most, but in reality his pride and emotions had gotten the better of him on more than one occasion. When his bloodline had been upgraded, the impact of his negative emotions had diminished, but not its impact on his personality. In that sense, perhaps he too was a slave to his bloodline. We can't kill Wyatt now, but we need to capture someone who was in the castle. We need to learn what these inquisitors are up to. Jake refocused the conversation after clarifying his thoughts. Drying up her tears, Carmen rubbed her eyes one last time before putting on a fierce expression. Leave it to me. I've got a perfect candidate for this. She smirked evilly. Just remember, we'll have to kill the interviewee. Jake added as he saw her getting excited. He had no intention of letting this person escape, only to reveal to the enemy that their grand scheme had leaked before its due time. Even better. The vampire chuckled. Cough, so who's our target? Jake asked, while clearing his throat. Carmen immediately pointed to a pretty, overly made-up brunette wearing a Victorian Gothic dress mixing black and purple. The vampire wasn't very tall, about 150 centimeters, but she made up for it with her large breasts and an angelic smile. Too bad that the white napkin around her neck was stained with blood. She had just finished her meal. Saren, Carmen said with hatred. Don't worry about it. She was a pro-vampire oligarch long before the corruption arrived. To her, other humanoid species are just food or toys she throws away after breaking them. The only reason I tolerated her was because of Wyatt's leniency. Now that he's flipped out and we have to kill him too, there's no need to hold myself back. Jake caught a hint of sadness in her very last words, but she was clearly more stable than before. She seemed to have made peace with her choice and its consequences. Guilt-free, she told him everything he needed to know about his target, including a bunch of unimportant secrets. Against all odds, despite her youthful appearance, this Saren was already 200 years old. To be accurate, most of the vampires of her faction were relatively old if compared to the lifespan of Earthlings. Okay, wait for my signal here, Jake said in a low voice. This capture mission, he was better suited to carry out alone. With his billions of fluid, he was no longer worried about running out of ether, since the fluid-ether conversion was 1:1. Chapter 461, Capturing Saren. AD Oracle Cloaking LVL-1 activated for 60 minutes. The owner of the Oracle device can evade Evolver's Oracle paths with an Oracle rank 2 ranks higher than his. 20 ether points consumed. AD Promotion LVL-1 activated for 60 minutes. The owner of the Oracle device can temporarily get 2 ranks privileges above his current Oracle rank. 100 ether points consumed. This time, Jake would leave nothing to chance. From what Carmen had told him, Wyatt was truly strong. As the grandson heir to the vampire progenitor of his own clan, he was an anomaly among the participants in this ordeal. The hierarchy of power among the vampires of Carmen's homeland was relatively complicated, but certain principles stood out. At the top were the original clans, headed by one or more vampire primogenitors. Because their body stats were so monstrously high, they had much better control over their impulses and blood energy. Just below them were the direct or indirect descendants like Wyatt, who had the potential to replace their parents as they aged. Next came the vampire nobles and their descendants, humans who were transformed directly by a vampire progenitor and who were sworn to an unwavering loyalty to the latter. This was the situation of Carmen and her sister Lily, whose grandparents owed their status to the Leash clan vampire progenitor. Still below them were the normal vampires, themselves transformed by a vampire noble. All the way down were the thralls and ghouls, bitten by normal vampires. The thralls still had a shred of sanity, while the ghouls had become completely enslaved to their impulses. They were the ones most at risk of giving in to their vices, their mental stats not being high enough to allow them to curb their evil nature. Vampire bloodlines of each type had an almost unlimited potential for evolution, but were parallel. In other words, through normal means it was impossible for an ordinary vampire to become a vampire noble or for a vampire noble to become a vampire progenitor. Their fate was basically set. However, unlike Jake, whose Murtharian bloodline would probably plateau at level 4, vampire bloodlines did not suffer from this limit. The more blood the vampires consumed, the older they got and the stronger they would become. All they had to do was to be patient and stay well fed. Unfortunately, this didn't come without its drawbacks either. As their powers grew, so would their vulnerability to the sun, as well as their attraction to human blood. Eventually, even the vampire progenitors would abandon their ideals, gradually sinking into madness and bestiality. It would then be up to their descendants to end their lives. Wyatt had not yet murdered his own father, but he definitely had the potential to create his own clan. He was once a young man beloved for his benevolence, and that's why Carmine and Leash liked him so much, but he also had his dark side. According to she, the involvement of such participants in a third ordeal was often a sign of great underlying danger. Whatever Wyatt's main mission was, it wasn't to solve the mystery of the emergency beacons. And clearly, he had failed or didn't care anymore. Because Wyatt was Oracle rank 13, First Lieutenant. When he'd learned this, Jake had immediately wondered if Carmen's real plan was to murder him. Even with Tim's luck and his current power, he wasn't sure he would fare much better at his second ordeal. The end result would have been the same regardless. To get such a high rank in only 2 ordeals, this Wyatt had to be absurdly good. Carmen didn't know his current ether and body stats, nor the level of his vampire progenitor bloodline, but she had seen him in action more than once. He was at least 10 times stronger than her. Knowing that Carmen body stats were 10 times that of a normal human, that spoke volumes about his true power. Doing the math quickly, Jake estimated that after upgrading his bloodline, his body stats were barely a match. Nevertheless, he had a trump card, ultraviolet radiation. Like the Zorians, Wyatt would pay dearly if he tried to face him unprepared. Jake was practically his nemesis. Of course, he had no intention of telling Carmine his secrets. He preferred to let her think he was unsure of his odds. In any case, although Saren was an easy target in comparison, he had better be careful. Who knew if Wyatt wasn't actively monitoring the area and the status of his subordinates? Mentally prepared, Jake silently infiltrated the village, letting the soft earth at the edge of the village swallow him up. Like a superhuman mole, he crossed half the village in the blink of an eye, without alarming anyone before stopping 100 meters below Saren. Unsuspecting, the noble vampire continued to indulge in her guilty P.L.E.A.S. And Jake saw firsthand just how twisted a vampire mind could be. First, she whipped a prisoner to the brink of death to warm up as he heard her joke about it, before slaughtering him like a lamb for Eid. His blood was collected in a bowl, which she used to gargle her throat before spitting it all out on the floor. In fact, she spat before reaching for her handkerchief to wipe her lips. The group of vampires standing nearby burst out laughing, then went back to their own game, already looking for a new victim. Saren was about to choose another one, when she felt a frightening presence appear at her back. Facing that presence, Jake also held his breath, stilling and retracting his spirit body into his fluid core to the point where it became indistinguishable from the rest of the glowing runes marking the ground above him. "What are you doing, Saren?" A warm, yet blood-curdling voice asked the vampire casually. Turning around, she came face to face with an attractive man with pale skin and medium-length blonde hair. His ruby irises were seemingly able to penetrate her soul, and she was struck by the feeling that her most shameful secrets had been exposed under his gaze, brimming with wisdom. W.I. Wyatt. I was checking on the welfare of our prisoners. The vampire lady stammered, her loathsome arrogance a distant memory. At this pathetic excuse, Wyatt mustered up a polite but undoubtedly scornful smile. By slitting their throats, he commented in feigned surprise. Miss Saren, I would be happy to learn more about the Clan Yellmayer's medical knowledge. After all, this is the first time I've heard of checking someone's health by cutting their throat. Caught with her hand in the cookie jar, Saren abandoned her simpering and snorted. I was a little hungry, okay? What's the big deal? We've got hundreds more. It's not the end of the world if we wreck one or two of them. Wyatt smiled again, but the next second Jake heard multiple bangs. In a heartbeat, the so-called Saren had been viciously grabbed by the throat and shoved through many layers of rune-reinforced walls. Stunned and coughing up blood, Saren remained on all fours for a long time under Wyatt's disdainful gaze. Crouching down in front of her, he brought his mouth to her ear. Don't ruin my plan, am I clear? He whispered in a threatening tone. I don't care about these prisoners, but I don't want them to die needlessly. Her red eyes glowing with rage, Saren raised her head to him and stared defiantly. You mean Lily's death and the others weren't unnecessary? You seemed to be enjoying yourself at the time. I wasn't the only one having fun. We all saw you go wild. You don't have to teach me anything. You're just an asshole and a fucking hypocrite. Alas, her string of slurs came to an abrupt end when Wyatt savagely ripped out her vocal cords. Without a windpipe and with half her throat intact, the reckless vampire collapsed to the ground choking. Remember, the youth threatened as he licked his bloody fingers with an insatiable expression. If what happened to Lily and the others was just an accident, if you continue with your bullshit, your death won't be. Control yourself. You'll be free to do what you want once the ordeal is over. With that last warning, the vampire progenitor walked away and Jake finally dared to breathe. The heartbeat he'd been holding back all this time resumed, kick-starting his blood flow and oxygenating his brain. After this incident, luck seemed to smile on him. Depraved and angry, the busty Lolita moved away from the village to vent her rage and vexation. Pounding, punching, and kicking everything in her path, she continued to lash out until her throat was regenerated. Once her vocal cords were restored, she cursed loudly. What a fucking prick. Saren's spirit body was punctured instantly, the mental attack hitting her consciousness squarely. Spacing out, a terrible pain exploded in her skull. She tried to scream for help, but no sound came from her mouth. Seeping into the breach, Jake had already taken control of her nervous system. Squeezing a few nerves and blood vessels, the vampire passed out the next second. Mission accomplished. Chapter 462. Why? Saren's wake-up call a few minutes later in the forest was brutal. Aired. Two severed arms and legs were separated from their trunks as they squirted out impressive gushes of blood. Separated from the greater part of her oracle device's liquid alloy, all the functions of her oracle system were shut down, except for her oracle AI and the one regarding her status. Communicating with her faction was now impossible. Gritting her teeth and gasping as if she were about to give birth, the vampire lay prostrate on the floor with an expression of agony. For FUCK's sake, who the FUCK are you? The vampire noble shrieked with her face flushed and congested with pain and rage. Jake ignored the young woman's cursing of his ancestors and took the opportunity to cheerfully absorb the liquid alloy in her bracelet. He wasn't exactly short of it, but it was always good to have a little more. To his utmost delight, Saren had killed more than one player in the past, and the severed limbs contained quite a few pounds of alloy. Because his space storage was unusable in this monster game, he was still only carrying 12 tons instead of the 27 he had. The downside was that his bracelet was less efficient and yielded less ether, but in exchange he was definitely faster and lighter. One could not always have it all in life. Sensing that Saren had no intention of shutting up anytime soon, Jake waited patiently for Carmen to rejoin him. When she saw the bloodshed, the woman gawked in shock, but quickly regained her composure. As for Saren, she was so gobsmacked when she recognized the familiar face that she finally shut up for the first time, giving Jake a welcome respite. Alas, the silence was short-lived. Bitch, how dare you betray us? The hardcore vampire began to abuse her with insults. You would collaborate with this despicable cattle to plot against your own kind? Shame on you. Shame on your clan. Carmen showed remarkable composure as she in turn was called names, but slight tremors betrayed that she was not that unmoved by the slurs. A reddish glow pulsed behind her pupils, and like Wyatt earlier, she punched the throat of the impudent woman. Deprived of her arms and legs, the arrogant victim choked, her bustiched writhing on the floor before finally catching her breath as she began to wheeze. Cough, cough. Ow. Saren shot them a look brimming with hatred and madness. Kill me, we'll meet on the other side. Carmen, I hope your clan is there to protect you after your treachery. This time it was Jake who lost his patience. Levitating what was left of her body in front of him with his telekinesis, Jake focused all his mental power and killing intent on the defenseless vampire. The apex predator golden glyph emerged in the depths of his galactic eyes. I'm going to level with you, so listen up. I won't repeat myself. Jake somberly pronounced word by word. You like to torture your prey before you put them to death, don't you? I don't share your hobby, but believe me, I can do a lot worse. If you don't tell me what I want to know, the rest of your ordeal will be a living hell. I will keep you alive as long as I live and break you to force a contract slave on you. After that, I will continue to inflict the worst abuse on you until you can't even remember your own name. After making these abject threats, Jake paused briefly. He took the opportunity to transfer thousands of mental images of torture and other abuses that he had read in a history book as a child. It was just bluff, but his acting and killing intent were genuine. With the insidious impact of corruption on him, it was not entirely inconceivable for him to carry out his threats. Under the influence of apex predator and the corruption impairing her sanity, it didn't take much to break her down. In fact, even Carmen stared at him with a horrified expression. I'll talk. She stuttered, sweating profusely. Despite her vampire vitality, the severe blood loss and pain was starting to take its toll. Good, Jake grinned. Now let's establish the slave contract. What? Hearing that he still intended to have her sign a contract, Saren lost what little of her noble aura she still had left. Relax. I'll add the usual clause about releasing you after the ordeal is over. Jake said with a straight face. You didn't expect us to take your word for it, did you? Saren winced, but in the end she breathed a frustrated sigh when she recognized her body's condition. What could she do without arms and legs? Especially since even now, she still didn't know how she ended up here. She only remembered an intense headache. Then, it was a total blackout. When she woke up, she was in this state, tormented by excruciating pain. Fine, I'll sign it, she muttered in a tiny voice. Having accepted her fate, Saren proved to be extremely docile after that. She and Jake set up the slave contract, and she told them everything she knew about the Inquisitor's visit. As they already suspected, these Inquisitors had not come for tea. The first duo of Kagarim and Emive, representing Grandmaster Isbius, had come to formalize an agreement to attack the village of Sigmar at nightfall. The second pair of Inquisitors, to their surprise, had come for the same thing, but this time on behalf of an individual named Nilreg. Tonight, the village of Sigmar and Avi would be wiped off the map. Now kill me. I hope you managed to kill that bastard Wyatt. Saren closed her eyes, waiting for him to end her agony. Jake had originally intended to kill her, but now that the slave contract had been successfully established, he thought otherwise. Carmen, is Wyatt the type to read the minds of his subordinates? He asked. Both Carmen and Saren exchanged a troubled look. Wyatt, I don't think he's capable of that, Carmen said hesitantly. He can't. Even if he could, he wouldn't. Saren spat with disdain. He may look confident, charismatic, and supremely intelligent, but most of all he has the longest, thickest broomstick up his ass I've ever seen. He may be the grandson of a vampire progenitor, but he's still a VRGIN wet behind the ears. Embarrassed by the dying vampire's vulgarity, Carmen blushed ever so slightly before clarifying. Wyatt is known for his uprightness and candor, but mostly for his fighting strength. Though he should theoretically excel in all of the vampire arts, he is known for his inability to perform even the most basic hypnosis spells, just like his father. It could be a family thing. Jake was skeptical and full of questions, but that was good news for them. With a deadpan face, he reconnected Saren's limbs to her chest, returning just enough liquid alloy for her bracelet to function as normal. The vampire cursed him inwardly for his cheapness, but she refrained from complaining aloud. She was alive. That was already more than she'd hoped for. Jake was somewhat reluctant to let the hateful Saren survive, but she was far more useful to them alive. The longer it took Wyatt to find out that their plan had leaked, the better for them. He was willing to wait until Saren could walk again, but as soon as her limbs were reconnected, reddish filaments sprang from each end of the severed limbs like mini tentacles. Blood energy gathered around the injured limbs and the damaged nerves. Bones and muscles recovered at a prodigious speed. It took the assistance of Jake and Carmen's vitality ether to speed things up, but within minutes Saren was back on her feet. When he saw a sick, carnivorous sneer on her face, he immediately threw a nasty uppercut that brought her to her knees. Jake gave her then a set of mercilessly strict instructions to prevent her from exploiting a fault in his words to disobey. Only then did he let her go. Corruption had totally taken over her common sense. Once Saren was out of sight, Jake finally turned to Carmen and suddenly slammed her against a tree with his telekinesis. The shockwave sent all the nearby birds flying, while the leaves of the shaken tree rained down on them. The vampire did not resist, merely staring at him blankly. "I have a question," he snarled coldly. "Why are you the only vampire still sane? Don't answer right away. Hear my theory first. Everyone who has a bloodline with some monster or bestiality in them is vulnerable to corruption, and they all got the monster role by default, which accentuated and accelerated that process. However, oddly enough, this is not your case. Your original role was henchman. Why? Henchmen could identify monsters at a glance, but the latter were oblivious to their identities being disclosed. If Jake had figured out anything in this game, it was that unique roles weren't handed out by accident. There had to be something that set her apart from her brethren, and he refused to believe that she had no inkling of it. His instincts were telling him that her sister's death had something to do with this. Chapter 463, Sigmar's Village. Faced with Jake's questioning gaze, Carmen didn't think for a second about backing out. Tired, she answered with the only plausible reason that could explain it. "Because I'm not a vampire. I mean, not literally," she confessed as she stared into his eyes. "Go on." Jake nodded. "I didn't lie before. Me and my sister Lily are indeed from the Lich clan, and my grandfather was indeed turned by its vampire progenitor. But not us. My mother was already born at that time, and we were simply adopted into the clan. The vampire progenitor and the rest of the clan took care of us and educated us as if we were part of their aristocracy. To protect us, the vampire progenitor and grandfather regularly gave us their blood and used many blood arts and herbs to strengthen our bodies. Over time, our bodies have changed, and we have developed most of the attributes that characterize vampire progenitor offspring, but still remain human. Unfortunately, because we have become dependent on blood energy, we still need human blood to sustain ourselves, but unlike other vampires, the urge is not nearly as strong." Jake released the grip around her throat, and her frail body slowly slid to the ground. He also noticed as he pinned her against that tree that she was once again skin and bones. Massaging her sore throat, Carmen visibly relaxed as he saw that he had accepted her explanation. Still, he hadn't let go yet. "What's your bloodline then? I mean, if you're not a vampire noble, how does your oracle status identify you? Excuse me for speaking bluntly, but a bloodsucker with fangs doesn't really qualify as human anymore." Carmen flinched at being called inhuman, but she saw no point in hiding the truth any longer. "I'm a blood human," she said calmly. "A grade 6 bloodline, but one that has the potential to evolve by consuming high-quality blood. Using the mirror universe terminology, my body craves the ether code and energy contained in the blood of humanoid species." At that moment, she gazed at his neck, licking her lips with a longing look. Jake felt an inexplicable chill running through his body as he watched her behavior. He felt like the last piece of meat in a dog's bowl, his fate unavoidable. Snapping his fingers in front of the vampire's face to bring her back to the conversation, but also to mask his embarrassment, Jake waited for Carmen to pull herself together. "Sorry," she apologized, not sounding sorry at all. But your blood was damn good. My body stats went up 20%, and I can last longer in the sun when I take my ring off. Your ring. Jake perked up. Yes, all vampires have one if they want to walk around in the daylight. The poorer ones use sunscreen, but a ring, bracelet, or pendant are still the absolute best. To demonstrate, she dangled her right hand in front of his eyes, and Jake did indeed find a gold ring on her ring finger. Tiny inscriptions in an unknown language had been carved on its outer surface. For a moment he had thought she might be married or engaged, but apparently she wasn't. What? You thought I was married? She teased him upon seeing that he was somewhat out of it. Unwilling to indulge her, Jake ignored her teasing and set off for Sigmar Village. Their meeting was scheduled to take place soon. Carmen harumphed quietly, but after smoothing her dress, she walked in his wake. Trotting alongside him, she decided to strike while the iron was hot. Jake! She simpered softly, her former frostiness gone. What? He snapped back. Can I have some more blood? In the end, they arrived at Sigmar Village about 10 minutes later. They were slightly ahead of schedule, but that was all to the good. They hadn't been able to kill Wyatt, but his village would be attacking this place by nightfall, so it was even better. Jake intended to take advantage of the confusion to deal a fatal blow to as many of his enemies as possible. To do this, he preferred the battlefield to be in a different village than his own. Upon arriving, Jake and Carmen immediately noticed that this village was better developed than theirs. The infrastructure was more advanced and extensive, as if they had been stuck in the Stone Age while this one had advanced technologically by several millennia. The most spectacular thing was these black turrets with a double gun that seemed to have been directly cast out of a huge black crystal. Native Titan Pearl soldiers were stationed at each of these heavy artillery machines and were vigilantly monitoring the area around the village. When Jake and Carmen emerged from the forest, two of these heavy turrets were immediately pointed at them. At ease, soldier. Avi's gruff voice echoed through the village as if she were shouting into a megaphone. She had apparently returned before them when Ilfra had come to pick her up. After this order, the turrets pointed their guns elsewhere and resumed their surveillance of the vicinity. The duo then took the opportunity to meet with the Titan Pearl's general. Avi, who only reached Jake's navel, still found him terrifying, but known for her recklessness, she gave him a big hug and patted him on the back with loud slaps, as if they were old friends. Why the fuck are your muscles so hard? It feels like I'm hugging a block of steel, and my hand hurts. He heard her mutter resentfully. With a rictus stuck on his face, he had to hold himself back not to return her slaps. No doubt she wouldn't try it again after that. Where is Sigmar? Carmen asked urgently as she spotted a vein pulsing on the young man's forehead at her side. Avi really had no idea what kind of ticking time bomb she was messing with. Remembering why they were there, Avi stopped playing the tough guy and motioned for them to follow her. On the way, they found Edmund, the chief officer assisting her in all her tasks, but he pretended to have a lot of arrangements to finalize and slipped away. Jake said nothing, but felt something was wrong with him. His sense of smell wasn't as good as Kevin's, but it did rival that of a dog. This man was wearing makeup. It was not the case before. He looks old, but his cells are young. Carmen confirmed his suspicions telepathically. I think I've seen him somewhere before, and I'm not talking about the Titan Pearl. Jake stiffened imperceptibly as he listened to the vampire, but he shared the same opinion. To tell the truth, even Grandmaster Isbius struck a chord with him. If they could make themselves look as young as they wanted, it was plausible. Eureka! All of a sudden, he remembered where he had seen this Edmund. At that moment, his voice was altered and he was wearing a long black hooded robe like those of the Inquisitors. This is the guy who explained the monster game rules to us in the first round. Jake concluded with a grim expression. When Carmen heard his answer, she had to make a huge effort not to take to her heels and run away. Is this a trap? Should we run? She panicked involuntarily. Too late for that. Jake glared at the door in front of him, or rather at what was behind it. During their discussion, Avi had led them to the castle, and they were now standing outside its gates. This is as far as I go. The usually brave general cut a constipated face at them before ditching them without looking back. Obviously, she didn't like interacting with the people inside. Jake didn't have her qualms. Indifferent, he pushed the door open with a flick of his forefinger. The large stone hall that revealed itself to him was dimly lit, but just as luxuriously furnished and decorated as the one in his first castle. The difference was that the furniture was more modern, and the owner seemed to have an unhealthy fondness for dark colors. A long golden carpet, the only touch of warm color in this eerie and spooky environment, ran from the door to the large throne sitting at the end of the hall. This throne also appeared to have been carved out of a huge black crystal, and many spikes fanned out behind it, like a peak, performing a courtship dance for a female. On this throne sat a youth, while to his right and left stood two inquisitors. The one on the right was Ilfra, whom he was already familiar with, but the second guy, it was his first time meeting him. By its stature, it was possibly a woman. Yet it was not the presence of these inquisitors that transfixed him, but that of the young man sitting in the middle, because Jake had met this person before. If the old ghost hadn't reported to him a few days earlier, he might never have considered the possibility. At first glance, there was nothing special about this man. Pale as if he rarely exposed himself to the sun, short and unkempt black hair, a beardless face, well-made but casual clothes, not very tall, and lastly a slimness characteristic of a sedentary person spending too much time on a computer with a poor appetite. "Hey," he uttered. "Let's talk, Jake." Chapter 464 Revelation, Part 1. With a nod, Haid, or rather Sigmar, dismissed the two inquisitors at his side. Ilfora complied without batting an eyelid, but the second one only moved after a while as if he wanted to say something. But the youth kept ignoring him. Not getting the attention he sought, he bowed and left the castle as well. When the doors of the great gate creaked shut, Sigmar abandoned his aloofness and turned to Carmen with a wistful frown. "Can we trust her?" he asked as he rhythmically tapped the armrest of his black crystal throne with his finger. As he asked this question, the black of his irises extended to the whites of his eyes. After a few seconds, his eyes returned to normal, and a mischievous glint ran across his face. "I guess so. Jake, I'll let you decide," he said with an amused look. The man in question frowned in turn, not exactly thrilled with this privilege. It was as if he didn't even have a choice until Sigmar gave him permission. "She can stay," Jake replied stiffly. Due to his wary nature, he didn't fully trust anyone. Here corruption could make his family and friends act in unexpected ways, as demonstrated recently with Kevin and Sarah. That was why he had given up his plan to patiently and methodically improve his roles through recruiting and protecting more and more villagers. Somehow he knew that this purgatory experiment made no sense, and neither did this monster game. Its creators seemed to have already grown bored of the game, as if he had already found his answer. Thus, Jake didn't care if Carmen turned on him afterwards. Whether it was his own intention or because of the corruption, he was ready to face whatever this ordeal would throw at him. Ironically, Jake's acceptance of her was interpreted completely differently by the young woman. In spite of her usual coldness, an innocent smile briefly flitted across her face, bringing a little warmth to her taciturn bearing. Sometimes, a small gesture could go a long way. Once at ease and Carmen's presence accepted, Sigmar dropped his pompous ways, reverting to Haid's amiable persona. "I know you have a lot of questions, so I'll try to answer them first. I'm listening." The young man pulled a bag of CHI.PS out of nowhere and began to munch leisurely. This was what Jake wanted to hear, and he already knew what he wanted to ask. "Was our first encounter planned, or a fluke?" he asked with an intense look. Haid noisily chomped on his potato chip before chuckling. "Both. From the moment you woke up, you got our attention. Not just mine, but Minerva's and many others. You may already know her as Isbius." Jake winced laconically as he heard what he dreaded. The old ghost was right. In order to unravel the mystery behind the emergency beacons and provide an accurate and extensive report of the situation, the fluid ghost had used the few memories he had left to fly back to the Titan Pearl and begin his investigation. The Titan Pearl may have departed the station against all expectations, but it hadn't gone far. Like all the SH.I.P.S of the past expeditions, it was orbiting lethargically a few kilometers away from Yotai Shuren 3, infested with fluid ghosts and parasites. The passengers still alive were incubating a new generation of monsters if they had not already killed each other. Possessing someone to access the surveillance room hadn't been too difficult once all the heavyweights had deserted the ship. With the codes he remembered, and considering that his former self was directly involved in the sabotage of the Titan Pearl, accessing the archives had been a breeze. He was then able to effortlessly identify who had woken up first. Some of the records had been erased, but the passenger's awakening from hypersleep at the beginning of the ordeal was properly recorded. And therein lay the clincher. Jake had woken up first, at least according to the official record panel. And the reason was fairly straightforward: his Murtharian bloodline. His body stats surpassed that of the natives and the majority of the players. In a context where their biological and brain functions were sluggish and their skills unusable, his recovery speed surpassed even that of the Inquisitors on board. The odd thing about this was that it was a detail that had bugged him from the moment he woke up, and should have concerned him all along. But in the end, as soon as he had met Minerva, a nerdy technician in her 40s, his worries had gone out of his head. Afterwards, when he had sighted the first passengers present in the Titan Pearl's refectory, and then met Hade, he had simply thought that the time of waking up had little to do with their physical abilities. That couldn't have been further from the truth. The reality was that he had been manipulated into thinking that way. His arrival in the mess hall, though innocuous, was staged. Whether it was the Inquisitors, Hade, or the few other passengers present, none of them were normal. So it was no surprise that his early presence had aroused Sigmar's interest. Those who joined the dining hall afterwards were almost all players, but at the time Jake had no way of knowing that. It wasn't until 1 or 2 hours later that the normal passengers began to fill the dining hall. Except that by then, Jake and his comrades had long since finished their breakfast. Also, if Jake had been more ruthless later on, he could have coerced Avi into giving him access to all these data much earlier. Finding the saboteurs would have been much easier, especially with what he knew today. A passenger named Tatega, as well as some members of the technical staff, had officially never woken up, or rather never really slept. They were theoretically already awake when the anomaly occurred. Hade was like a ghost too, his name absent from all records. He was literally a stowaway on the Titan Pearl. The only good news in all of this was that the old ghost had at least found his first name, or at least the details of the identity he was embodying at the time of his death, since he was part of the awakened personnel before the anomaly. That's all it took for Jake and she to realize that they had been hypnotized and manipulated by someone into missing all those details. It wasn't until the fluid ghost reported to him that they became aware of the subterfuge. Perhaps the spell had also weakened over time, or the increase in his mental stats had changed everything. And the real culprit behind it all the evidence pointed to Minerva, or rather Grand Master Minerva Isbius, his first encounter on the Titan Pearl after coming out of hypersleep. Second question: if you were aboard the Titan Pearl and had no hand in what's happening on this station, who's holding the reins here? Jake did his best to regain his composure before continuing his questioning. Carmen was also interested in this question, notwithstanding the fact that she knew nothing about this Sigmar except that he was an extremely powerful fluid wielder and wanted by the consortium. My son Nilreg, Hade admitted with surprising detachment. My greatest joy, but also the cause of all my torments. The purgatory in which we are now, and which serves as the venue for this monster game, is a fluid artifact that I gifted to him on his 5th birthday. Since then, what was once just a toy for a special child has grown to incommensurable proportions. Noticing the stupefaction of the player in front of him, Hade smiled wryly. Let me tell you the story from the beginning. You're the 3rd player to hear it, so hang on to your seat. I'm standing, Jake blurted out unmoved. Who were the other two? Carmen inquired suddenly. Wyatt Griffith and Boris Slomitsky. Wyatt. It didn't go as well as I'd intended because of his bloodline, plus Minerva and Nilreg's interference. As for Boris, he woke up right after you on the Titan Pearl, but his character is somewhat problematic. He holds the largest criminal village in the south. Back to my story, let me reveal something first. It was I who summoned you to this world. When a fluid grandmaster reaches the top, he will begin to touch the fluid's confines. I am no exception. With our minds powerful enough, the ether's existence becomes obvious to us, and we have the opportunity to switch our energy source. As you know, ether is not nearly as simple and intuitive to use as fluid, and that's why most fluid grandmasters never take that step. They will sooner or later lose their self-awareness as their affinity and intimacy with the fluid of the cosmos increases. The fluid is not pure energy and feeds on all kinds of information, thoughts, knowledge, and emotions. Whoever knows how to listen can obtain all kinds of powers and innate knowledge, which at the highest level comes close to the knowledge ACCU.mulat in this universe since its very inception, but sadly one cannot choose what to learn. Sooner or later, you end up being engulfed. Like a drop of water trying to absorb the ocean, the only consequence is to become part of the ocean itself. However, if we choose ether, the oracle finds us and an oracle device is provided for us. Because of our power far exceeding that of a first ordeal player, we are given many options. I have chosen to remain in this world to protect it and oversee any ordeals that may take place in it. Yet, I do not have the authority to decide when and why players will be sent here. Except in one circumstance, if this world is threatened and I lose control of the situation. Jake and Carmen were sporting ugly faces at this point. They didn't need a drawing to guess what was coming next. And indeed, Sigmar confirmed their suspicions. Digesters. They are the very reason why everything is going wrong here. Chapter 465 Revelation, Part 2. The Digesters? They're here, Carmen exclaimed in shock. Not exactly, but they may as well be, Hade proclaimed grimly. Observing Jake and the young woman in turn, the fluid Grandmaster wore an apologetic expression. Unfortunately, this is mostly my fault, although I did bring forward their arrival a little bit. Since I don't quite know what you have heard about me, I'll first tell you what you need to understand. At this point, keeping the secret from the participants is no longer important. Wait a minute, if these are digesters, why haven't we been repatriated to the mirror universe? Jake interjected, raising his hand. That's what happened when their presence was discovered during my first ordeal. Hade blinked in astonishment, but immediately pulled himself together. Carmen was still shocked. Never had she considered the possibility that these hellish aliens could appear here. When she had arrived on B-842 with her sister, the members of her clan there had exterminated a staggering number of them, giving them the misleading impression that apart from their ugliness and stench, these monsters were greatly overrated. Thinking they could easily score points for their oracle rank, they blithely continued to slaughter them, until the pile of digesters' corpses formed a small hill. They paid dearly for their overconfidence. Such a concentration of vampires in one place naturally meant high concentrations of life energy and ether. It wasn't long before they were surrounded by a horde of millions of digesters, who at the time were fortunately mostly rank 1, 2, or 3. For vampires like them, it was small fry. But with numbers like that, an army of ants could easily defeat an elephant, and that's exactly what happened. A few guards at the bottom of the ladder had been overwhelmed by a swarm of enemies after being isolated, and their merry slaughter had immediately taken a much more dramatic turn. After devouring the flesh of these vampires, the digesters had instantly mutated. Rank 1s became rank 2s, rank 2s became rank 3s, while some rank 3s also reached rank 4. On top of that, even those who hadn't leveled up had mutated, adopting various physical and magical attributes once characteristic of their kind. In addition to gaining the ability to absorb blood, their bodies began to release a kind of dark blood energy that was unpleasantly similar to their own, while some digesters with alien shapes acquired outright humanoid features. These new digesters had then gone into a frenzy, like these new thralls and ghouls unable to control their instincts. The problem was that this time their increased power allowed them to threaten not only the normal vampires, but also the vampire nobles. As the snowball effect spread, more and more vampires fell, feeding the ranks of the enemy, until the first vampire noble fell victim to these insatiable demons who knew no fear. A new series of evolution and mutations ensued, giving birth to a flock of rank 4, 5, and 6 digesters that bore an uncanny resemblance to their last victim, one of them practically becoming a perfect copy. This digester's tuxedo may have been an organic protrusion, but Carmen was still having nightmares about it today. In the end, half of their group had been slaughtered, and if their vampire progenitor hadn't found them by some unknown method and saved them in time, they would have all died without exception. The only reason Carmen and her sister had survived was because their relative and many other vampires who had watched them grow up had sacrificed themselves. You have not been repatriated to the mirror universe, because familiarizing yourself with the threats the Oracle faces is the purpose of this third ordeal. Sigmar explained seriously after giving the young woman a sympathetic look. The Oracle has many ways to train you, depending on your current level character, and circumstances, but it tends to favor immediate exposure. If it were possible, every ordeal would be a battlefield where you would face hordes of digesters until you knew them better than yourself. Unfortunately, this is impossible. I don't know why, but the Oracle is powerless against them, and if a digester were to kill you in an ordeal, you would die for real. At least that's what naive people think. The raw truth is that the Oracle will not save you. Even if your soul survived, you would be considered dead. The Oracle sometimes makes exceptions, but they are few and far between. Jake snorted disdainfully upon hearing this. Yep, he knew about that. Protecting my soulmate? Bullshit. It had gotten him stripped and almost killed. Getting back to how the Oracle exposes you to this threat, it can range from ordeals where digester-like creatures exist to almost situational ones like here. The corruption produced here by the parasite converters has little to do with the one generated by the proliferation of digesters in our world, but it is no less dangerous for this seed world. Eventually, all the inhabitants of this universe will lose their minds and kill each other. Devoid of reason, civilizations will disappear and then die out completely, with anarchy reigning supreme. 140 years ago, I was sent by the consortium to a certain allied planet that was being invaded by unknown enemies. Not having received my Oracle device at the time, I too did not know what I was up against. My power was sufficient, so I and my men had no trouble exterminating them. Unaware of what they were, we spared a few of these monsters, as well as salvaged a few corpses in good condition and migrated to Yotai Shuren 3 and began our experiments to understand their biology and the origin of their ability. You have no idea how much I regret it today. To put it in context, I had accepted this mission because Minerva Isbius was giving me a hard time. As one of the oldest fluid grandmasters, she saw me as a threat. I hadn't completely converted my fluid to ether yet, but I was close. Minerva is so sensitive to the fluid that she lost her emotions long ago. All she has left is her pursuit of power and her ambition. By accepting this mission far away from the consortium, I had sent her the message that I wasn't interested in encroaching on her turf, and I had hoped that our feud would end there. My plan was indeed successful at first, until I learned that I was being held responsible for the demise of the planet I had just saved. Having just eliminated all the digesters, it could only have been Minerva's scheme. Having become a fugitive, I settled on Yotai Shuren 3 and our research, which was more of a hobby at the time, began. We had, and I apologize for this, more success than we had hoped for. Although the corpses' souls had already dissipated and we could not reproduce the etheric signature of the digesters in our hands, we tried to get as close to the originals as possible. The parasites on this station today are the result. Unaware of this at the time, our mistake of sparing several digesters for study ended up having irreversible consequences. In particular, the corruption. The corruption you are experiencing today has little to do with the corruption we were exposed to back then. The corruption you are experiencing is merely the result of the release of a putrid fluid produced by the converters, one of our failed creations. Although the living digesters we own were few in number, and the corruption emitted infinitesimal, it was the real deal. Wherever it grew, digesters would thrive. As you may know from your investigations on the station, I fell in love with Wendy on this station, and we had a son a few years later. He was a beautiful and valiant baby, but Wendy died soon afterwards, drained of all her vitality. It's rare, but it happens sometimes when the child's fluid core is overdeveloped. I accepted this grief without suspecting anything. Nilreg, though quiet and not very expressive, was intelligent, curious, and had fun like any other child. There was no reason to suspect that this was just a delusion. Because he was my son, he was born with an activated fluid knight core, which gave him all the predispositions to become an exceptional fluid wielder. Proud and full of hope, I trained him body and soul from an early age. The research went on, and when he was 5 years old, I gave him the fluid artifact where we are now. During those years, the corruption kept building up, and even though the incidents were multiplying, I simply blamed them on fatigue and stress from being confined on a space station for so long. A year later, we had one death. That's when I realized something was wrong, but it was still a fleeting inkling. It took 2 more deaths and the insanity of one of the fluid masters under my command for me to realize the extent of this danger. But it was already too late. Everyone went crazy like a powder keg in front of a match flame. At that point, I did what I felt was necessary. I sealed the station with my powers and exterminated all of our digester's guinea pigs, including the ones that had spawned without me noticing. They were mostly insects or small rodents, and I didn't immediately make the connection. I also personally executed all those who had lost their minds. I then cremated and ejected the ashes of these monsters and employees into the cosmos. The experiments ended and the project was classified. After that, the situation quickly returned to normal and our lives resumed, but the damage was done. Because there was one digester that I had overlooked to kill. The only one I would never have suspected. My own son. Chapter 466 Revelation, Part 3. Both players were quite taken aback by this shocking development. I thought he was your son. How can he be a digester? Jake snarled, not trying to contain his disapproval. The vampire was equally unconvinced. Fully expecting their negative reaction, Hade was still somewhat disappointed. Stifling a weary sigh, he reconfirmed this unnerving truth. Nilreg is my son, and he is certainly a digester. As for the reason, I'm afraid you'll have to find out for yourself. I have my theory, but the Oracle won't let me share it with you. Perhaps he was born with it. Perhaps it was his mother who was affected first, or perhaps he came in contact with or was infected by some of our guinea pigs. But to know what he truly is, you will have to earn that right. So to speak, Nilreg has never really behaved like a digester. The first time he behaved abnormally was, unfortunately, one time too many. He stole some parasites we had created without anyone noticing, and then incubated them in his own body. Why he did this, I don't know as of yet, but what I do know is that after that he has never been the same. He survived his incubation, and the parasites he created regarded him as their mother, obeying him at the drop of a hat. As for what happened next, I don't need to draw you a picture. The first converters matured, allowing the corruption you know today to spread rapidly through the station and beyond. It quietly infected all but a few of my people, but their fluid sensitivity made them more vulnerable to the corruption than the others. With his digester nature, my son's power also grew rapidly. His character began to deteriorate. He spoke less and spent a lot of time in his fluid artifact. I thought for a long time that he was suffering from being the only child and just needed friends, but I couldn't have been more wrong. When he turned 10, the incidents and then the random deaths resumed. Panicked, I searched the station from top to bottom looking for the culprits, but it didn't work. When I found the source of the evil, I wanted to eliminate it immediately, but my son stopped me. Or rather, everyone. The fluid masters that I treated as my brothers suddenly glared at me with unmistakable contempt and hostility, as if I were a stranger who had just murdered their parents. I still remember their names and faces at that moment, so cold and alien compared to their usual joviality. With a dazed look on his face, Hade blinked and took a sharp breath to compose himself. Somehow, these memories were still haunting him. They escorted me to my son, who was playing as usual in his fluid artifact. I didn't dare believe it, but deep down I knew what would happen. Proudly, Nilreg invited me into his purgatory, which he used to call Dreamland, and showed me the results of his years of experimentation. I have never regretted offering a gift so much, because what I found inside were authentic digesters, as well as an army of hunters, converters, and controllers covering the ground to the far reaches of this artificial dimension. The most horrifying thing was that despite the fact that my son was a psychopath, the joy and pride he took in showing me his creations was genuine. The smile he gave me at that moment was the same innocent smile I remembered from years earlier. But none of this shocked me as much as what followed. Wendy, my deceased wife whom I never thought I would see again, stood before me, smiling exactly as I remembered. I don't know how he got his DNA after her body was cremated, but make no mistake, that thing was not my wife. It was a digester like any other, cold as a reptile and devoid of any maternal instincts. The only emotion I could detect in this creature was a compulsive hunger to devour me, to assimilate my genes and my fluid in order to become stronger, to evolve into a more perfect life form. In retrospect, I certainly should have reacted differently, but I killed it in one fell swoop. I slaughtered everything my son had created in one breath and watched as what little childlike humanity remained in his little eyes was extinguished, replaced by the alien coldness that belongs only to these monsters. I was hoping it would end there, that we could talk about it, but unfortunately it did not. The whole station ganged up on me, and I was forced to flee. Nilreg was not yet as strong as I was, but his digester abilities quickly strengthened as the battle went on, and he fully embraced his true nature. My men assisted him, along with all the parasites under his control. I ended up mortally wounded and fled. However, I fulfilled my duty. I decapitated Nilreg. It wasn't until years later that I realized that his death hadn't ended the problems, and I returned to the station. Everyone had long since been killed, and my former men had joined Minerva's service under various identities. I didn't meet my son that day, but I eliminated all the parasites thriving on Yotai Shuren 3. I repeated this routine several times a year, continuing to exterminate these creatures until I realized that their numbers and strength were growing faster and faster. That's when I realized that maybe my son was still alive. After another purge, I was ambushed on the way back by my former men, Minerva, and my own son, who was 16 at the time. By this time, he was already as strong as I was. I survived, but the injuries were severe. I gave up trying to fight them. I cleared the electromagnetic storm preventing them from leaving the station, but against all odds my son restored it to hide his own activities. I retreated to a place far away from any conflict and devoted myself to my training. The corruption had affected me badly, and I was a shadow of my former self. If I didn't do something, I would sooner or later fall into madness too. I converted my fluid to ether and prayed for someone to hear me. About 50 years later, the Oracle did hear me. I hoped he would neutralize my son and save my universe, but that is not what happened. My world was simply classified as a Level 2 endangered world. An Oracle Guardian materialized in front of me and listened patiently to my report after giving me a bracelet. He then left to investigate the situation by himself and returned a few days later. It was then explained to me that this world would be put under surveillance, but that they would not intervene until the situation became critical. Instead, they decided to hold ordeals there, and I would be the supervisor. Obviously, an agreement was also made with Nilreg, because he never created digesters again. Over the past century, Nilreg and his parasites have faced hundreds of thousands of players like you, but few have come close to the truth. Some have interacted with Minerva or her minions. Others have traveled to the planet where the rift first appeared 140 years ago, while others have joined research labs to study the anatomy of these monsters. This endangered world is just one of millions that is used to prepare young evolvers for this multiversal threat. This ordeal is special because I was the one who asked for backup. Nilreg contacted me 2 years earlier to inform me that he was tired of playing and wanted to end it. You rejected me for who I am, and I reject this world for the same reason. But you are still my father, so let's not miss this last chance to say farewell to each other. Whatever the outcome of our meeting, whether I get my answers or salvation, whether this world survives or falls apart, I will leave. Those were his very words. I deferred what he said to an Oracle Guardian, and this ordeal was scheduled in a hurry. You were asking me earlier why you weren't repatriated? The answer is simple. You are the bait. This space station is currently surrounded by an entire armada of Oracle Guardians, and they are waiting for something. Whatever it is, I hope you're long gone when that thing arrives. Nilreg can't leave this world by himself. Jake and Carmen remained tongue-tied for a long while after that tale. Thinking back to that final sentence, they shuddered with horror. The idea that an army of Oracle Guardians were using their relative immortality to use them was enough to make their blood run cold. Subconsciously, Jake looked around with trepidation, even going so far as to use a scan to locate these glorified warriors, but to no avail. If these guys could be detected so easily, they wouldn't have earned their standing as Oracle Guardians in the first place. He didn't know if Oracle Guardians were all equally powerful, but if they were anything like the one that had chaperoned them at the beginning of his second ordeal, then they weren't an opponent that the current Jake could compete with. Exhaling slowly to rid himself of his nervousness, Jake forgot his other questions and reported what they had seen and learned while questioning Saren. Haid, now acting like Sigmar again, showed no surprise, as if he'd been expecting it for a long time. Nodding, he said gravely, I have already made the necessary arrangements. Go back to your village and wait for the result tomorrow morning. If you still want to fight, I won't stop you, but I need you elsewhere. Saying this, Sigmar entrusted him with a strange crystal in which was carved an exquisitely realistic village, forest, lake, and mountain. At a glance, Jake recognized the map of the monster game where they were currently stationed. Take this artifact with you. It will show you the way. Chapter 467. A promise is a promise. What is it? Jake asked as he scrutinized the object from every angle. He had a vague idea, but he wasn't entirely sure. A key and much more. Sigmar smiled mysteriously. Even if it was a present to my son, a fluid artifact of this caliber is never given without taking a few precautions. After all, mishaps can always happen, or it could be stolen. Being able to locate it and regain control at any time has always been my privilege. My son doesn't know it, or maybe he does, but he has modified this fluid artifact so much that he probably thinks it's impossible. I can no longer use this key to control his fluid artifact remotely, but that doesn't mean it's not feasible with direct access. To give you a more graphic example, anyone who thinks they know their computer better than the manufacturer is naive. Even if I can't access its contents, restoring the factory default settings is still pretty simple. The fluid artifact itself is hidden somewhere on this station. I want you to find it and use this key to turn it off. You can even take it with you away from here if you feel up to it. I won't stop you. Just know that despite my best efforts, reaching the purgatory core itself will not be risk-free. It's the very foundation of all his plans, and probably his most precious possession. There's no way he would have left it unprotected. Jake weighed the pros and cons for a long moment before finally agreeing with a solemn expression. Since becoming a fluid master, his precognition had reached a level where he could foresee the extent of what was truly afoot on this station. The night ahead promised to be bloody. As Jake and Carmen were about to leave the castle, Sigmar's sullen, resolute voice floated behind them. If I survive, let's be friends. I have a nagging feeling we're not that different. Concurrently, he received a notification from the Oracle system. Sigmar Elsenire applies to join your faction. Accept his application, yes or no? As he finished reading the message, a funny expression appeared on Jake's face, followed by a quiet but meaningful laugh. He accepted the application willingly. Now I can see how you're planning to survive. Jake muttered as he pulled the large door shut behind him. Hopefully, the whole mess with your son will end well. Likewise, Sigmar mumbled as he slumped back into his throne, seemingly drained of all his energy. After that, Jake took no further interest in this village and made his way back to his own fiefdom without looking back. If Sigmar lost, his town would be next in line. A few moments later, Jake and the young woman reached their own headquarters. They were startled to discover a village much more crowded than when they left. Evidently, the negotiations had gone more smoothly than expected. Kephis and the two sisters were back with Mahangel and Ralner, the two Aegeans running a village of players, while Kyle was also present. Kyle hadn't changed much, except that his insecurities and weak-mindedness seemed to be gone at last. In his case, the corruption had helped him shed his limiting thoughts. A kind of madness and eagerness to fight distorted his features, but considering the forthcoming battle, it was actually a good thing. In fact, everyone was in a worrying mental state. All of the players gathered here were among the folks for whom keeping their sanity was paramount, but it was also for this very reason that they were willing to risk everything in forming an alliance. Jake also found some of the so-called criminals that Kyle had joined. Their leader Boris wasn't there, but Wild, the tattooed guy with the shaved head, was. He still seemed just as crazy, but ironically it was hard to tell the difference with or without the corruption. Perversely, his insanity appeared to safeguard his sanity in the current climate. So you're the guy Kyle's bragging about. Wild grated as he stomped out a cigarette butt on the floor. I hope we don't regret this. The offender clearly wanted to say more, but upon seeing the icy indifference of the giant in front of him, he swallowed and wisely chose to refrain. With an amused smile, Kyle introduced the players around him. You already know Wild, he said, pointing to the guy with the shaved head. The others are Shuliov, Kirchin, Valentin, and Yamabe. They will stay here with me to assist you. They all have the roles of traveler, thief, and monster hunter. Jake examined the 5 players with fresh eyes. Most of them looked like they were from Eastern Europe, but Yamabe was clearly Japanese. However, as he listened to them speak, he quickly noticed that each of them had the same Asian accent. They are all part of a Yakuza gang in Japan. Boris, Wild, and the others are immigrants who grew up together in an orphanage. Together, they have formed a faction called the Pagans. It was amazing how a well-off American student could be so comfortable introducing a bunch of thugs as if they were harmless friends he had met at a bar the night before. Yamabe, the only Japanese man present, was thin as a twig and his skin was tattooed with a huge Chinese dragon. An eerie aura emanated from it, as if the dragon were alive and not just a stain of colored ink. When Jake thought he was done with the introductions, the player approached him and frowned with disgust after sniffing the air. "Are you the one who killed Chinen?" Jake pulled the tattooed strip of skin he had torn from the latter's corpse from his bag and waved it before them. "So what?" he sneered. "From the moment he tried to kill me, it was the only logical outcome." Yamabe was silent for a few seconds before nodding gravely. He had accepted this explanation. As for Wild and the others, they couldn't care less. That jerk got what he deserved. He had it coming to him for messing with everybody. Wild snorted loudly. "Yeah, Boris spanked him a few times for that very reason." Kirchin, a dark-haired man with a wrestler's build, chimed in. Jake then listened to the Playboy's adventures since their separation, and it turned out that everything had gone well for him. It seemed that Tim's luck had rubbed off on him. With this method, he was able to effortlessly identify the monsters as they moved through the night and force them to surrender or eliminated them if necessary. It was only after this that he eventually rebuilt his house and began to play the game normally. In the end, he never really played by the rules. For him, all of these rules were there to be broken, and Kyle had relied heavily on this model to survive through those 2 rounds. He and Boris both had criminal status and had used that as a basis for all their other roles. They had been to the pit together a few times, but now they had the status of Knight Barons, allowing them to flout all the rules at will as long as an enforcer didn't catch them red-handed. As the sun was about to set, Jake didn't have time to hear more and went to find Will to get an update on the latest developments. Will looked exhausted, but there was a hint of satisfaction on his exhausted face. "Ah, Jake, there you are," the businessman exclaimed with relief. "I've been waiting for you, man." Jake already knew what Will wanted from him, since they had discussed it earlier in the morning. In addition to the Sigmar membership application he had accepted, there were about 150 applications pending. Will had accepted them preliminarily, but was waiting for the leaders Inders and T to accept them fully. These factionless players would remain on probation until the end of the ordeal, but after enjoying their faction passive skill, the likelihood of them quitting was fairly low. Given the green light, the merchant contacted all the faction members with his bracelet, while Drastin whistled to get the attention of the crowd. "A promise is a promise," Jake declared in a booming voice. His tone gave the illusion that he was speaking softly, but it rang in the heads of every player and native as if he had just whispered right into their ears. From now on, if they wished, these players could choose to end their ordeal by leaving this place. This was the choice made by a minority of them. The rest remained with a steadfast resolve. Those hardened players who chose to stay were clearly not of the same caliber as all those wimps who had survived by chance. Noting the faces of those who had chosen to leave, Will cross their names off the list of probationary members. They would be expelled from Eartharian nerds once the ordeal was over. Chapter 468 Night Commando Mission. Jake then took advantage of the opportunity when the whole village was gathered to beg for more jackpot and lottery cards. Sadly, only Mahangel, who was not part of his faction, held such a card. He did, however, retrieve a nice stack of lottery cards. However, from the crowd's cautious attitude, he quickly noticed that not everyone was honest. He therefore had to clarify his intentions, which was actually the least he could do. If you didn't miss the brief purgatory shutdown, you probably saw the station walls reappear for a short time. Will finished calmly. "That was us. We caused the equivalent of a power outage when we diverted all the fluid generated by that fluid artifact. To replicate this feat in a sustainable way, we will need much more fluid than that. For those who participate, you will be compensated in proportion to the profit generated. So this is not an extortion, but an investment." Will said no more, and Jake didn't see fit to add his 2 cents either. As for the more or less 600 natives in the village, Jake had no solid way to convince them. Although it was indeed possible to establish pseudo-contracts using their fluid cards, apart from a few simpletons, no one was fooled. If the fluid artifact was really deactivated permanently, then the runes enforcing these contracts would no longer have any hold on them. His real target was the nearly 150 players who had joined his faction. On the one hand, a contract could be established through the Oracle system, But more importantly, even if they died Jake would still be required to pay them once back on B842. In the end, less than a quarter agreed to contribute their fluid, 37 players and 112 natives. Seeing this, Jake and Will's expression hardened. With another eye contact, the businessman crossed off a second batch of names, many more this time than the last. Much of their selfish behavior could be attributed to the corruption's influence, but even the worst sociopath should have a functioning brain. If they were lucid enough to seek refuge with him, then their refusal to cooperate was inexcusable. Fortunately, Mahangel proved to be more promising than his uptight would-archmage demeanor suggested. He gladly gave up his jackpot card, but his condition was that he would not take his eyes off his investment. That is, Jake. This meant that from now on he would have to deal with Mahangel and Fire Knight Ralner tagging along until his plan came to fruition. In and of itself, this wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Ralner was in a foul mood, overcome by his desire to kill, but Mahangel was remarkably serene. Perhaps his nature magic had some techniques for placating the mind when faced with those sorts of nefarious influences. Jake then went to visit Peter Brady, who was still between life and death. There he found Kawani and Svara, who were doing their best to take care of this difficult patient. Kawani's healing potions had stabilized his wounds, but did not seem to be able to cure him. The third conviction in the pit was clearly not of the same ilk as the previous two sentences. Kawani felt she could save him by brewing a more potent healing potion, but to do so, she would have to upgrade her witch roll and obtain rare herbs that could only be obtained by drawing the right treasure card. There was no time for that. Even in front of them, the dying drug addict with only a right THIGH and a charred torso left didn't seem to really care about his condition. CZT3. T3. The player spluttered in his restless sleep, his eyes flaring open suddenly, but somehow still unfocused. Jake raised a questioning eyebrow at Kawani, who was tending to the dying man, and she shrugged exasperatedly. It's an artificial neurotrope found in the Titan Pearl's pharmacopoeia, she explained as she sponged Peter's forehead. It causes a euphoric trance that is hard to imagine in addition to completely inhibiting pain. It's normally used to relieve terminally ill victims of radiation. That's why he kept pestering Daryl. When he died, Peter got the last few doses, but instead of rationing it, he used it all at once. The two sisters who were silently listening to the conversation were stumped. With his body stats and the Murtharian body passive, shouldn't it be impossible to drug us? Essia exclaimed in wonder. Kawani let out a long, exhausted sigh, but didn't find the courage to respond. It was Will, as a good soul, who took it upon himself to elaborate. He knew all the important items in this ordeal, whether it was the food on the Titan Pearl or the cards in this monster game. If it was for humans, it shouldn't affect him all that much. But this is a world where most professional soldiers are fluid wielders. Their metabolism and recovery is much faster than normal people, and this drug is designed to work even on fluid adepts. With his current stats, his withdrawal should take about 2 days. But he's been in this state for more than 2 days, right? Drastin objected dismissively. Svara opened her mouth as if to say something, but hesitated at the last moment, not quite sure how to bring it up. It was Kyle who gave the Black Warrior the answer he was seeking. Aera. A heartbreaking yelp of pain assaulted their eardrums. Peter Brady opened his eyes wide while breaking out into a sweat, a hurt and resentful expression straining his features. Gritting his teeth, his gaze fell on his THIGH stump, into which a sword was now embedded to the hilt. Stop faking it, Kyle said mercilessly. Then he slowly withdrew his blade. The Murtharian nerds now face-bombed with embarrassment. Then Jake snorted softly. Bury him under the sun and light a fire. If he asks for drugs again, have him eat a rock. Peter Brady's indignant eyes almost popped out of his face as Kyle and Tim grabbed the log and took it somewhere else. Kawani and Svara stared at him in abhorrence, while Mahangel distinctly muttered, "Friggin' barbarians," but made no move to interfere. Of course, Jake wasn't trying to kill him. Although Peter did not have the accelerated healing skill, he was part of their faction and therefore was enjoying all the perks provided, including the Murtharian body passive. Even if his limbs didn't grow back, keeping him warm underground should be enough to keep him alive until the ordeal was over. "Goo guys, I'm feeling much better," After a few minutes, Peter's overstressed, pleading scream resounded abruptly from outside. When Jake and the others went out to take a look with amused smiles, Peter's charred-looking skin had returned to its normal state, while tiny, babyish, still pink feet and hands were growing grotesquely from his stumps like ugly swellings. Kyle and Tim had long since dumped him into the grave they had dug for him and were about to fill in the hole when this miracle happened right before their very eyes. If this astounded and entertained the bystanders of this event, Kawani's and Svara's facial muscles, which had been wasting their time tending to him, twitched with anger. "Peter!" the two women shouted with bloodshot eyes. Striding briskly toward the grave, Svara extended an open hand toward Kyle as if to grab something and ordered aggressively, "Hand me the shovel." Peter was in for a rough time. As the druggie was buried alive by the two young women while squealing like a pig being slaughtered, the sun finally set, and the people returned to their homes. All those who wished to were gathered together in his castle, while Jake and some of the players gathered inconspicuously in a small wooden hut outside. In addition to his regular faction members, Carmen, Drastin, Kawani, Svara, Peter, Hephis, Mahangel, Ralner, Wild, Kirchin, Shuliov, Valentin, Yamabe, Paveo and Ostrexera were also present. Peter had given up begging for his dose of CZT3 and was now showing a ghastly face, regularly casting horrified glances at the two young women. He was now sporting a disgusting pair of arms and legs comparable to those of an 8-year-old child. If the result was as disturbing as it was ridiculous, at least he was able to move. "As soon as it starts, we'll get to work." Jake finished the briefing and probed the faces of everyone present, especially Peter as well as Wild and his men, who seemed in a hurry to leave. With everyone agreeing to the plan, Kyle nudged Wild, who nodded in kind. From his backpack, he pulled out several sets of identical boots and capes. Will also placed a wooden crate on the table, which contained identical garments. In the end, there was enough to outfit 10 people. With this, you have what you need to activate 10 traveler roll cards. I wish you luck. Wild ragged, knowing full well that without the legendary card that went with it, these clothes would remain completely useless. This card was extremely rare, but not nearly as scarce as the jackpots cards. Jake wasn't the only one who had managed to get one. Regardless, it was still a difficult roll to acquire. 10 was the number of such cards they had managed to assemble for tonight's secret mission. Ultimately, it was decided that Carmen, Hephis, Mahangel, Ralner, Enya, Essia, Peter, Kyle, and Tim would accompany Jake. Because Ostrexera could roam freely at night as an alpha monster, she would also join in. Chapter 469 Signal. Drastin, Svara, and the others who wanted to come along bitched for a while, but they accepted their fate. The Troll Slayer would have made an excellent addition, but unfortunately his fighting style was a bit too brutish. He didn't really excel at stealth, which was an absolute must for their upcoming mission. Paveo frowned as he realized that none of his men had been chosen, but he had expected as much. Other than the fact that they were both Earthlings, Jake had no reason to trust him, especially when he had openly admitted to following Colonel Hale's instructions to him. Most importantly, if anything happened to Jake, this village would be theirs, which was an acceptable outcome. Jake and the others could guess what was going through his mind, but none of them broke his dreams. If Paveo really did attempt a coup, he would experience firsthand the bestial fury of a troll and a Valkyrie in action. But that was without counting on Will and his minions. Since he had received the musician role, he had tamed a significant number of creatures. On top of that, there were also all the players who had recently joined their faction that they could rely on. Even though most of them had already been crossed off the probationary list, counting on them to take out a few outnumbered soldiers was not a problem. "When do we start the operation?" Tim asked again, making big swings with his axe to warm up. Will rolled his eyes after explaining the plan for the third time in a row, but it was in this kind of situation where his businessman's coolness showed its full value. Patiently, he repeated a fourth time. "When AV Village is attacked and Sigmar personally enters the battlefield, we'll take action." "How do we know that's the right time?" Tim pouted pensively with his index finger resting on his lips. "What do we do if Nilreg and Minerva don't show up? Or if Sigmar lied? Or if he dies too quickly? I don't want to meet them on the way, nor do I want to run into an army of bloodthirsty monsters. As the saying goes, The truth came out of the mouth of children. Releasing Will from his burden, Jake flatly retorted, "It's a risk we have to take. Fight and maybe die, or hide and go crazy and then die too. I'd rather fight." "Well said. Let's slaughter them." Drastin roared as he flexed his huge biceps. "You stay here." Jake snapped at him indifferently, causing the warrior's infectious exuberance to collapse. The latter grunted his displ.ea.s.u.r.e, but he had no intention of protesting. Even if their plan worked, this village would surely be under attack by morning or the next night at the latest. "Will there be any drugs to keep us going?" Peter asked out of the blues with expectant anxiety on his face. Everyone ignored him unabashedly, and his distress increased another notch. His little legs jiggled nervously as he struggled to his feet to tug on Kawani's dress. "At least something to drink? A numbing herb? Clove? Mint?" the addict asked with growing desperation, his last words practically whispered as he wept loudly. Will was about to shoot him down when a sly smile appeared on his face. Daryl was a spy for the First Brotherhood, which unofficially serves Minerva's interests. He said airily, "I've heard they have a drug even more powerful than CZT-3 to stabilize the Inquisitor's souls and keep them under their control. Maybe they carry it with them." This was not a lie. Because of their failed ascension, the Inquisitors' minds were constantly being tossed around by the fluid and the storm of information and emotions it contained. Although they hardly felt any emotion, they used these advanced drugs to drown out the multiple voices competing within them and driving them to madness. Upon hearing this, Peter's faded gaze regained its light, and a determined expression appeared on his face. "Let me handle the Inquisitors," he proclaimed solemnly as he placed his right fist against his heart, his frivolity gone. Jake rolled his eyes again, but at least they would have some peace. All they had to do now was wait. With a snap of his finger, a telekinetic shockwave burst from his body, pressing the walls of the wooden hut with unstoppable power. Instantly, the outhouse exploded, the purgatory runes offering only insignificant resistance to this overwhelming force. A moonless, starless night sky was revealed before their eyes, and each of them looked southward, waiting for the fateful signal that would change the course of this ordeal or dash all their hopes. "They are coming," Ilfra said, standing to the right of Sigmar, who was still slumped nonchalantly on his throne. "Did you do what I asked?" "I did," she replied gravely. "Avi and the promising recruits have been evacuated. Only the traitors, the martyrs, and the lunatics remain." It was only after receiving confirmation that Sigmar dropped his icy facade of dreaded fluid grandmaster. Gently lowering the hood, then removing the visor from the woman at his side, he gazed regretfully at the immaterial face woven only of energy lines giving off a dim bluish light. "You can run away too, Ilfra. I won't hold it against you," Sigmar suggested as he stroked her intangible face, a rare expression of tenderness on his pale face. An aura of sadness radiated from the female Inquisitor, but she did not shy away from his touch. "It's too late to run," she sighed. "My fate has long been sealed. If this oracle is as powerful as you say, then this battle is my chance to get my body back. From the moment I signed that servant contract with you, I knew what I was getting into. Then let's fight together one last time," Sigmar declared as he put Ilfra's helmet and hood back on. "If we survive, I promise to make sure you can feel the CARESS of the wind again." At that moment, he stiffened imperceptibly and muttered with a bad feeling, "Where is Crodors? He should be back by now." "Don't bother." A grating, cruel female voice suddenly echoed from the castle entrance. "I'm afraid your underling has already given in to madness. His loyalty has proven to be much more fragile than I imagined." With that, the great door flew apart, and a crumpled black robe hovered in front of Sigmar's throne, as if intending to lay a new carpet. Looking down, Sigmar and Ilfra immediately recognized their comrade's coat. The youth's face darkened noticeably after seeing this, but he simply closed his eyes numbly. "So you still came, Minerva?" He growled ominously as he opened his eyes again. The whites of his eyes had turned completely black. At that moment, a murderous aura erupted forth from his body. The will for destruction it contained so terrifying that the castle walls began to tremble, the runes covering them sizzling as if they were about to disappear. In response, a second, equally powerful aura burst forth from across the hall, clashing with his without giving an inch. The first aura was pure and translucent, while the second was thick, dark and slimy, as if it had long since been corrupted and denatured by something unhealthy and alien. After a short clash, the runes gave way and the huge stone castle exploded with a phenomenal flash, as if a nuclear bomb had just released its power inside. A blinding white light flashed in the retinas of all witnesses for 10 kilometers around, while a mushroom of flames and smoke rose to the sky. A few miles above the ground, the sky was torn apart by the smoke, revealing the ceiling and pipes of the station for a few seconds before closing in. When the witnesses regained their sight a few seconds later, half of the village had been destroyed and a second shock wave ensued, sweeping away the few remaining buildings. Jake and his team were quietly watching the sky when they saw the explosion and heard it a minute later. Chapter 470, I'll wait a bit longer. Holy cow, they're going at it like crazy. Will sweated profusely as he saw the blaze of fireworks in the distance. Lucky for us, that's not where we're going. Ralner snickered as he gripped the hilt of his sword tightly for reassurance. The others remained silent, but each of them had paled noticeably. Tim's axe swings in particular had grown more vigorous, as if he were trying to distract himself at all costs. Jake furrowed his brow, but refrained from assuaging their concerns with sweet talk. No matter how favorable the situation sounded, he was pretty sure their enemies wouldn't let them get away so easily. If Sigmar was defeated, they would have Nilreg on their tail immediately after stealing the Purgatory Fluid artifact. If it wasn't Nilreg who dealt with them, he would at least send his subordinate men, monsters and players after them. Put another way, they would have to fight no matter what. If Jake had been given a choice, he would have taken a few more weeks to consolidate his roles, explore, and train more, but he could tell his temper was nearing its limit. Everyone was on edge, some already on the verge of losing their minds. Kyle regularly stabbed the tip of his sword into his leg, wincing in pain by choice for the sole sake of staying sane. In a way, this was already a sign of madness. Peter was going through withdrawal, and his feverish depression was threatening to degenerate into something much more terrifying. As for the two sisters, they were meditating aside from the group to steady themselves, but it was clear that it wasn't all that effective. Carmen was staring hungrily at his carotid artery, resisting somehow, but certainly not for much longer, while Ostrexera. He preferred not to know what was going through her mind at the moment. In the end, the Commist were still Hephis, the Aegean assassin and Mehangel, but their composure had also changed in the last few minutes. Jake himself could feel the renewed self-control bestowed by his bloodline's evolution fading fast. In just a few minutes, he had gone from stoic and vaguely irritable to wanting to kill anything, including his comrades. It was like a mosquito bite in the middle of his back, impossible to scratch. The corruption was intensifying, and this change had been brought about by the explosion born of the clash between these two powerhouses. Based on his estimates, they had maybe an hour or two ahead of them, and not a day or two as they had originally hoped, before flipping out one after the other. Leaving in 2 minutes, he growled with a worsening sense of foreboding. Will, Drastin, Svara, and Kawani, I'm counting on you. The two women promised not to disappoint him, while Will refrained from any optimism. He had a nasty feeling that he was losing the control he had recently gained over his creatures, and the bloodthirsty troll slayer, next to him, was doing nothing to improve that. He missed his Charizard. To ease his mind, Jake checked his equipment and his Oracle status one last time, and the rest of the party did the same. For a minute, there was complete silence, the only noise being the handling of the weapons and other equipment they would be taking with them. Checking his ether storage, Jake's grim expression softened somewhat. Ether storage, 11,154,659,752 points. To achieve such a fortune, he had taken the risk of converting more than half of his fluid into ether for the upcoming operation. It might prevent him from shining at the monster game, but as it stood, it didn't really matter anymore. If he didn't have to save the rest to short-circuit Nilreg's fluid artifact in case their plan A failed, he'd probably have converted everything by now. AD Oracle cloaking LVL1 and AD promotion LVL1 on. His ether reserves dropped by 120M in a split second, but that was the price he had to pay for being both stealthy and untraceable. To survive the night, he was willing to spend billions if necessary. Those with oracle cloaking or promotion like Hephi's and Mehanjul did the same. Wild and the other criminals serving Boris had already left, ready to execute their own part of the plan. While Jake and his team searched for the fluid artifact that brought this dimension to life, the pagans would take care of looting and demolishing as many enemy villages as possible. This was to turn them into vagabonds, thus stripping their enemies of the perks granted by their roles. Time's up. It's time to go. If anyone wants to say anything or edit their will, it's now or never. Jake joked, a rare bit of humor that sadly made no one smile. Jake, BL Blood. A faint voice stammered from behind him. Seeing Carmen's exposed canines and possessed look, he made an immediate decision. Grabbing his backpack, he pulled out a vial filled with a vermilion liquid. To avoid any bad surprises, he had prepared enough blood to transfuse himself completely at least twice. Drink. Smelling the so longed-for blood fragrance, the young woman's ravenous instincts kicked in, and she chugged it down in an instant. Her rosy face quickly regained its lucidity, but her thirst had definitely not been quenched. Still, that would have to do for now. Let's go, Jake said to the rest of the group as normal before setting off. Blaming her would do them no good. The two sisters gave her a mildly jealous look, but they jogged straight after him without picking up on the incident. Kyle and Tim, on the other hand, took their distance from the young woman. They had only just realized that they were standing next to not one, but two time bombs. The second, of course, was Ostrexera. As Jake started to move, she floated eerily above him, her semi-translucent body passing through the obstacles as if they didn't exist. You're more dangerous than before. I can feel it, she said curiously as his spirit body touched hers. Of course, Jake had no intention of telling her about his bloodline upgrade. Steadfast, he focused on the replica in his hand to find his way. The black crystal carved with a village, forest, lake, and mountain identical to the one in their first round began to pulse as Jake tuned his mind to it. The runes on the cobblestone floor they were walking on were forciblysukd into the artifact, only to be spit out as a glowing arrow of the same color pointing in a certain direction. Northeast. The group adjusted their course and accelerated sharply. The slowest of the group was Tim, but to save everyone some time, Jake took it upon himself to mobilize his telekinesis to transport all those unable to fly, namely Peter, Kyle, and the teenager. Enya and Essia shot streams of red flame from their hands like Iron Man to propel themselves, while Rauner did the same with his legs. Mehanjul conjured a giant bird of intertwined vines, while Hephi shifted into his shadow form, becoming virtually undetectable at night. Perhaps it was Tim's luck, but no survivors noticed their presence. The village of Avi, where the apocalyptic battle between three fluid grandmasters was taking place, was far to the south, the opposite of their destination. When they were about to reach their destination, Jake braked suddenly, his senses on high alert. A faint pain constricted his heart, but it subsided almost instantly. Lowering his gaze, he scanned the ruined village below them, unable to determine what had made his hair stand on end with fright. "Where are we?" he asked telepathically to the addict. Catching his warning glare, Peter, whose legs and arms had just about grown back, suppressed his irresistible urge to ask for a tranquilizer and cleared his throat awkwardly. "This is the Inuit village, the one because of which I finished in this state," the addict informed him with slight embarrassment. It was also the village where he had been cursed. Jake didn't scold him for not warning him. That was his mistake. He had listened carefully to Will's report, but in order to cut to the chase, he had ignored the villages in their path. After one last wary glance in the direction of a certain moth-eaten wooden shack, he turned away and set off again. A few dozen seconds after their departure, a bare C.H.E.S. Ted Eskimo with hair shaved on the side and long on top emerged from the said cabin. Soon, 6 other Inuit emerged in turn, including the young woman with a scar on her face who had greeted the 2 inquisitors a few days earlier. "You were right, Tatega. This is where the real battle will be fought. If we had really gone to fight alongside Nilreg or Minerva, we'd probably be dead," Keelit stated with a glint of ferocity in his eye. "I'm never wrong. That Nilreg is too wet behind the ears to handle me," the fur-clad woman boasted with a jaded demeanor. In her cruel and ageless eyes, A glimmer of wisdom that was hard to put into words seemed to reign supreme. To be honest, I'm more curious as to why my target is still alive. Keelit muttered moodily as he stared at the voodoo doll, crushed by his grip. This is the first time that someone has survived one of my curses head-on. The urge nagged at him to go after Jake and do it again, but Tega stopped him. Not now. Let's follow them first. When we know where they're going, we will eventually deal with them. A caustic retort almost slipped out of his mouth, but a traumatic memory about the female Inuit surfaced in his mind. Fine. Keelit swallowed his saliva reluctantly. I'll wait a little longer. Chapter 471 First Victim. A few minutes later, Jake slowed down as the new light arrow shot to the ground below them. Following the arrow's path laid out for them, the group began their descent, quickly breaking through the layer of artificial clouds to discover a new village, this time quite different from the Inuit village they had just visited. This village was intact, but desolate. In the far north of the map, the usual forest, lake, and mountain were present, but where the neighboring villages should have been, there was nothing but more forest and more lake. That no lights or torches were lit was not unexpected, but the dead silence was somewhat unnatural. It wasn't just because it was night and the villagers were sleeping, nor was it because its former villagers had fled the place after an attack. Considering the overgrown fields and gardens and the immaculate homes, this place had simply never been inhabited, and that made it all the more suspicious. On alert, Jake and the others set foot on land noiselessly, warily scanning the buildings around them. All the shutters were closed and every item was untouched, though it was best not to jump to conclusions. Pulling out the purgatory replica again, Jake waited for the local runes to be assimilated before generating a new light arrow. When it appeared, it pointed someplace straight ahead of them, but still downward. The problem was that, as far as he knew, there were no NTS, or underground passages in these villages. The castle's dungeons were the only facilities below ground level, and the direction indicated by the arrow was pointing the opposite way. In fact, they were headed for the village's central square. Cautious, they quickly crossed the distance to the amphitheater structure where the past votes had taken place. Since the start of Round 2, the relaxation of the rules and the rapid spread of the corruption, the daily vote had pretty much gone out the window. No lord wanted to lose his villagers. Aside from ensuring compliance, these votes served only as a deterrent. Vigilantly, Jake crouched down, placing a hand on the ground precisely where the arrow had fallen. As he feared, it was pointing downward, inviting them to dig in to continue their adventure. When his hand touched one of the cobblestones that littered the ground, Jake's expression did not change, but the fluid ghost hidden inside him took the opportunity to sneak through. Apart from Ostrexera, who followed the ghost's movements with her eyes, only Hephis and Mehanjel felt its presence clearly. The others with decent mental stats like the two sisters or Carmen felt an abnormality, but to preserve their minds they had retracted their spirit body, weakening their senses accordingly. Only Ralner, Kyle, Tim, and Peter did not notice anything, but they did take note of their comrade's change of expression. Nevertheless, it was coming from Jake and they had nothing to fear from him at the moment. At least, Ostrexera's ectoplasmic figure intimidated them much more. Jake was waiting calmly for his bracelet to return when he received bad news from she. He closed his eyes for a second to digest the information, but quickly adjusted to the new reality. Saren is dead. Jake calmly informed Carmen, giving her a serious look. The vampire freaked out for a fleeting moment, but the rabid hunger clouding her beautiful face quickly took over. Drawing a sharp breath, she chugged down another blood vial. The others didn't know who this Saren was, but from Jake and Carmen's reaction, they suspected that it didn't bode well. Sensing their questioning, Jake clarified briefly. Our mole at Wyatt's, the leader of one of the two big monster villages. No one commented, but a glimmer of understanding lit up the faces of Kyle, Peter, Mehanjel, and Ralner. Kyle remembered the vampire because of Sarah's betrayal. Peter had investigated them thoroughly, while the two Aegeans had met him in the command room of the Titan Pearl. All of a sudden, Kyle drew his sword and parried in extremis a powerful stroke from Ralner. The hell, man? The former playboy howled in rage. Ralner chuckled evilly in response. An aura of red flames similar to the two sisters enveloping his body and extending to his claymore. The tense but serene atmosphere within the group suddenly cracked, and everyone scrambled backwards, distancing themselves. TSK, he lost it. Mahangel sneered as he beheld his old friend turn into a raging beast. Stamping down hard, a wave of emerald light spread through the ground from his body. The group didn't notice anything special, but vines grew at a prodigious rate around Rauner, cracking and splitting the cobblestone floor. Within seconds, Rauner was immobilized. At that moment, a soothing sweet smell reached their nostrils despite the distance between them and Rauner. The toxin was so pervasive that those with the lowest constitution felt their legs go limp and their minds foggy. Kyle and Tim increased the distance another notch, while the two sisters produced a flame screen to clear the air around them. There was one moron among them who did exactly the opposite. Like a moth drawn to the brightness of fire, Peter started stumbling like a zombie towards the poisonous flowers with an intoxicated expression on his face. Drugs. Jake heard him babble repeatedly. Fortunately, Mahangel retracted his spell before giving him satisfaction. At the epicenter of the sweet gas, Rauner's frenzied fit ended abruptly, and a forlorn expression appeared on his face. Alas, like Carmen, his remorse did not last long, and his warlike diesterie soon recurred. Meanwhile, the old ghost had finished his scouting tour. Reaching back through Jake's hand and into his body, he confirmed their doubts. The purgatory fluid artifact is far below us, deep in the pit. Jake reported back to the group looking for guidance. Another issue is that the artifact is constantly moving. Its area stays the same, but in the pit a difference of a few feet could send us into a completely different room. The spatial laws here don't follow conventional logic. We have a bigger problem. Nephi scowled. How do we break the rules here? Everyone put on a grim face when they heard this. This was quite a predicament. Because they all had the traveler role, they could walk anywhere. And because this was not their village, whatever they did here would not be punished. The only solution left was to attack each other. So it remained to be decided who of Peter, Inya, Essia, Tim, Ostrexera, or Hephis would break the rules and how. Ostrexera, I know you are capable of surrendering and escaping the pit on your own. Why don't you show us how you do it? Jake suggested with a devilish glint in his eyes. The half-woman, half-ghost player snorted dismissively in response. Just because I went there doesn't mean it was easy, she retorted icily. Anyone can go in using their spirit body, but it's still a violation of the rules. I was punished severely for that. Don't underestimate the pit. It's a purgatory, not a resort. If the first sentence doesn't hit home, the next time we'll start to target your weaknesses, not to mention the elevated difficulty that goes along with it. I've been there 3 times already, and that's 3 times too many. Cough. I can confirm her statement. Peter grimaced with a pale face. The first 2 times were okay, but the 3rd time came really close to killing me. The 4th time will probably succeed. Jake stared at them hard as he gave them a murderous look. Who the fuck did they think they were? Let me put some lead in your brain. Jake growled in a low voice. No matter who breaks the rules, if you follow that person into the pit, you will be punished too. Whatever crap you've overcome down below, what we will meet this time together will be 10 times worse. We want to win, and I'll do anything to win, but some of us will probably die, maybe all of us if we fail. If any of you want to give up, it's now or never. Ostrexera gave him a murderous look, but she simply humphed without disagreeing with him. Peter merely shrugged as a way of letting go. Let's be honest. Jake resumed more gently this time. Carmen, Rauner, and Peter, you're the 3 closest to go bonkers among us. In the case of Rauner and Carmen, it would have happened already if we hadn't arranged countermeasures. If someone sacrifices themselves in your place, don't make them regret their choice. In the end, it was Peter who heaved a tired, defeated sigh. The sense of urgency, his withdrawal symptoms, and the corruption had consumed his last bit of fortitude. Fine, let me do it. Just, whatever. I'll drug myself to death once I'm back on B842. Chapter 472, 10 sentences. With that, Peter lashed out at Tim without warning, delivering a killer punch straight to the teen's heart. The kid tumbled backwards at the last second to avoid the blow just before his heart was struck. The ground instantly opened up beneath the druggie and the nearby runes converged on him, forming multiple chains in a semi-solid state that restrained him mercilessly. Peter pretended to resist, and the cobblestone floor slid further apart, an unprecedented gravitational force pulling him down into the abyss. The others immediately realized that it was not going to be that easy to accompany him in his suicide. Compared to the previous times, the chasm was not very wide, and the pull was so powerful and focused that they would have difficulty following him in his fall. They had to enlarge the gulf further. With tacit understanding, the group reacted accordingly. Jake deployed his telekinesis on Peter to lift him up into the air, while the rest of them, who could fly, took off after him to push him up. Carmen produced a chain of crystallized blood to attach herself to the addict, while Tim and Kyle clung to Jake like koalas so as not to be left behind. Mihangel stamped his foot once more and multiple vines sprang up all around the square, between the stone slabs, the grandstand steps, and even the rooftop of the houses beyond. These thick vines swooped down on Peter, then strapped him tightly to stabilize his position. Jake and the others did not let up yet. The gravitational force dragging the addict down was rapidly gaining strength, and the ground still refused to open up further. Mihangel kept producing more vines, creepers, and other woody plants to tie Peter down even tighter, and the others also intensified their efforts to save him. It was all fake, but after a minute in this stalemate, the pit apparently decided that it was no longer enough. In response to their efforts, the chasm swiftly expanded, engulfing an entire city block in a radius of 100 meters. The wood archmage's plants lost their support, and the drag they had been providing disappeared immediately. Jake and the others' strength was no longer enough. The balance was broken, and Peter slowly began to fall. Contestant Jake Wilderth, Kyle Gibson, Tim Parody, Inya Velsiel, Essia Velsiel, Ralner Bainan, Mihangel Sarkaran, and Carmen Leash broke the rules by helping Peter Brady escape his punishment at 23:28 a.m. during the night-day phase. They will be punished along with Peter by being sent to the pit. The sentence will be carried out immediately. If they survive their trial, they will reappear in the central square of the same village in front of the fountain. Even with his bloodline's power up, Jake felt the pinch and could only imagine what the others were going through. Tim and Kyle in particular looked like they were about to pass out. Now, Jake shouted breathlessly. He noticed 2 names were missing from the list, but he didn't have time to wonder about them. Receiving the message, a thick pedestal of multiple intertwined vines sprang up from the ground in the distance, and Mihangel leapt elegantly onto it. The trunk shot up at lightning speed toward Peter and the others, and he let himself be carried to them. Once there, Jake caught it with his telekinesis, and Mihangel took full advantage of the opportunity to tie them all tightly together with his vines. No matter what befell them during their dive, they would not be separated until they hit the bottom of the pit. Jake and the others stopped resisting the pull of gravity and began to plummet at breakneck speed. Just the fall alone might kill half of them. Ever since Jake had smashed his skull against Minerva's barrier, he had been dreading this kind of scenario and treated this descent into hell with extreme caution. The pit's familiar darkness enveloped them, robbing them of their senses, and 2 shadows sneaked in after them just before the chasm closed. They were, of course, Hephaes in his shadow form and Ostrexera in her ghost state. Seizing the chance to get through, they had used their allies' efforts to escape the AI's attention. Jake may not have been able to physically see them in the darkness, but his ether vision was fully functional. Annoyed, he glared at them, but the lack of feedback prevented him from knowing if his warning had gotten through. Luckily, Karma waited for no one. The Purgatory AI's robotic voice rang out again a few seconds later, announcing to the delight of Jake and his comrades that the 2 detected intruders would be subjected to the same punishment as the other 8. Ostrexera should have expected this, but she had still tried to pull a fast one on them. As for Hephaes, his powers were perfect for harnessing the surrounding darkness, and his gambit was easier to stomach. The freefall continued for several minutes, until a spark of blueberry blue began to expand beneath their feet. They had made it to their destination. Splash! Even with extensive telekinetic braking, Jake failed to reverse their inertia in time. They slammed into the surface of the murky pool at about 100 kilometers per hour, but thankfully it was enough to survive the fall. However, the trouble started as soon as their bodies came into contact with the liquid. A sense of euphoria and plenitude unlike anything they had ever felt before gripped their bodies. causing them to momentarily forget the harsh treatment that the gravitational pull had inflicted on them. Jake remained in a starfish posture for about 10 seconds, letting himself sink without the slightest hint of response. The dark and ugly thoughts that the corruption was slowly stirring up in him were temporarily suppressed along with his stress and resolve. Subconsciously closing his eyes, the urge to sleep gradually took over the last of his willpower. "Jake, pull yourself together." She jolted his mind awake as she gently nudged his consciousness with her own. Opening his eyes slowly, Jake hastily looked around and saw his unconscious companions in the same state as himself. His vision was clouded by a strange mixture of smoke and bubbles, and it was only after a few seconds that he realized it was coming from him. Without even consulting his oracle status, he quickly sized up the danger. "Something is sucking the water and oxygen out of my body." He fidgeted nervously, worried not for himself, but for his friends. This pool, though not very wide, was extremely deep and the liquid rather slimy and cold. Cold, to Jake, meant freezing to the others, enough to cause hypothermia within minutes and induce a coma. Assuming the worst, Jake forced himself to ignore the debilitating euphoria inviting him to sink and began to swim toward the nearest person. Not seeing much, he used his ether vision to recognize his friends, but something in the pool seemed to interfere with it. Beyond a few feet, he couldn't see much. After finding Tim and Kyle, he surfaced with their unconscious bodies. Thanks to their partial Mertherian bodies, they recovered quickly and regained consciousness within a minute. Knowing they were safe, Jake dove back into the tank to look for the others, but was relieved to see them resurface one by one without his help. Yet, after a while he noticed that one person was still missing. "Where's Peter?" Kyle pointed out. Ostrexera, who like Hephi's, had escaped the pool with her esoteric abilities, drifted underground before coming up a few seconds later without hiding any of her disgust. "Still alive. He's laughing like an idiot at the bottom of the tank, even swallowing the water inside to drown faster. I should have killed him from the start." Facepalming, Jake felt a headache coming on. The others rolled their eyes or cringed, but no one had any solutions to offer. "Cough, do we really have to save him? He seems happy," Essia asked embarrassedly. Jake hesitated for a long moment before sighing tiredly. "I'll get him." Diving like a torpedo, his glyphs A fish and water and extreme diver kicked in, allowing him to reach a decent speed despite the liquid's viscosity. Using his telekinesis to thrust him forward, he reached the addict in seconds. Still peppy, the junkie looked more frisky than ever, but his body temperature had already reached negative values. It was a miracle he was still conscious. "End of playtime," Jake roared telepathically in his head, jolting him out of his blissful trance. Far from being grateful, Peter tried to swim deeper to escape, but he had already reached the bottom of the pool. Grabbing him by the neck like a disobedient kitten, Jake dragged him back up to the surface against his will before tossing him to the ground like a dirty rag. "All there again," he said, kicking the sobbing victim he had just rescued. He was at least expecting a reaction from his comrades, but their focus was already elsewhere. Because there were 10 of them, their sentence had been adjusted. The pool they had just left was simply the first punishment intended for Peter. Indeed, a few seconds later, the basin began to boil, the blueberry liquid turning a tomato red. A fiery, sulfurous pestilence wafted out, making them retch all at once. Strange alien snakes as big as boas fell into the pot, one after the other, stirring up the mixture even more. If Peter had stayed inside, heaven only knew what fate would have awaited him there. And now they had to face 9 more punishments. Chapter 473, Dual Elements. Assessing his surroundings, Jake recognized the cavern where he and Carmen had been grounded earlier, as well as the same rock structure full of man-sized holes. These multiple tunnels together formed a complex network of galleries where darkness reigned supreme. The reason his comrades' attention was elsewhere was because countless pairs of yellow lantern-like eyes were multiplying dizzyingly all around them. Hiss! A wrinkled, clawed paw poked out of one of the holes, soon followed by thousands of others. The skin was a sickly gray with a network of dark veins, while the claws were ink black, long and curved enough to slit their throats effortlessly. The group immediately identified these hunters by their simian morphology, the thin tentacles acting as furs, and the row of long, translucent fangs filling their grotesque jaws dripping with saliva. Yet these parasites were significantly different from those they had already faced. First, they were larger. The smallest was larger than an adult silverback gorilla and likely weighed about half a ton. Their claws and tentacles were longer. Their tails ended in a pointed club as flexible as a whip, and they were much more agile. The larger ones could barely wriggle out of their holes, their bodies so stout that the cave walls would crack around their tunnel to give way. When one of them managed to get out of the gallery from where they came, hundreds of monsters waiting behind them would swarm out after them once the exit cleared. Once standing upright on their disproportionately muscular hind legs, the biggest ones reached 6 meters in height. But most notably, these giant hunters' eyes were no longer completely devoid of intelligence. In addition to their customary ferocity and greed, one could now detect malevolence. Tree-eye. Appalled by the shrill howl, Jake immediately spotted the controller perched on the tallest monster's shoulder. This hybrid parasite between a grayish spider and a withered baby was as nightmarish as he remembered, but he also hoped it would stay as weak as it was, blending into the background like a chameleon. If he didn't already have experience with these creatures, he might not have noticed it. Good thing for him. His Murtharian sight was on since his arrival in the pit. Shriek, shriek, try. A series of high-pitched shrieks coming from different directions soon began to resonate around them, transmitting all sorts of signals and orders that they were not equipped to interpret. However, the essence of their messages was still obvious. Kill them all. Knowing they were surrounded, everyone drew their weapons. Jake understood how dangerous these hunters could be with a controller coordinating them, but this time his previous strategy wouldn't work. The series of shrill screams had already guaranteed that there would be at least several dozen of them, some of whom didn't even risk leaving their tunnels to issue orders. What do we do? Enya asked, her face livid, but with the single-minded countenance of one ready for battle. Her long pink hair was tied back, and she was wearing a tight-fitting cutting-edge armor. In her right hand, she held a well-made short sword, while her left hand held a metal staff with a pink crystal at the end. Essia was similarly equipped. It was hard to recognize the two spoiled noble ladies of a few months ago, but how could they not change after everything they had been through? Jake scanned the cavern they were in with his senses, as well as the entrance to the galleries, and a grim glint flashed fleetingly in his eyes. "We're moving," he replied resolutely as he pulled out his replica. He had come to the conclusion that eliminating all the monsters in a short time was impossible. The galleries were filled to capacity as far as his extrasensory perception could stretch, and his hearing was picking up suspicious noises from over 500 meters away. If they really stayed there and fought them to a standstill, they might go crazy before they got through. With his decision made, the group formation tightened, each man covering the other's backs. Simultaneously, the controllers must have guessed their intentions, because the monsters suddenly tiered by the thousands ahead of the path that the light arrow was pointing to. "Fuck," Jake huffed, but for once he wasn't the only one. "Screw it, let's go for it." Neither of them were beginners. The fluid and ether flowing under their control suddenly streamed towards their legs, and reddish or orange auras quickly built up in their lower limbs. Even Tim and Kyle were quick to react. The only one left behind was Peter, turning around to cast longing glances at the deadly basin. His soul was torn between the dies irae to accompany them or die in bliss. Jake and the others were too busy planning their next moves and building up energy to worry about the guy. As they all charged forward as one, the druggie turned tail, making his way to the tank alone. With a hopeful and expectant look on his face, he dipped his canteen in, filling it up with the priceless nectar. However, just as he was about to close the lid, the wide-open mouth of one of the gigantic snakes that had dropped into the tank earlier popped out of the water and gobbled him up from head to toe. Another alien titanoboa also emerged a fraction of a second later and attacked its fellow snake without any qualms to reclaim half of the prey. Selfish and hungry, the first snake had no intention of spitting out its meal and loudly gulped down in response. The bulge containing Peter slid abruptly down the esophagus, and the snake dived again, vanishing into the abyss of the pool. Jake noticed from his first step that the addict had not followed them, and he watched helplessly as he met his doom. This time, he didn't turn around to get him out of trouble. The addict had just proved to them that he was no longer able to think rationally. Instead, he would focus on his mission and the safety of his 8 other comrades. To spare his energy and lower the monster's guard, they were going neither too slow nor too fast, but before long another free electron broke through, outpacing the rest of the group without a care in the world. Rayag, taste the steel of my sword. Ralner's furious roar reverberated throughout the cavern, and they saw a gust of red flame sweep over 100 of the hunters before them into the air. Spending his energy without regard for his stamina, the Fire Knight continued to swing his flame-wrapped sword with unparalleled rage. With each strike, a 6 or 7 meter long blade of red fire was released, slicing and incinerating several dozen monsters each time. Yet even with this firepower, Ralner was quickly overwhelmed and his momentum began to wane. The controller's single bulging silver eyes in the background were locked on the knight, and shortly afterwards another series of shrill screams rang out. The disoriented and FLU.S.tiered hunters instantly repositioned themselves, adopting a formation and stance that would allow them to easily avoid these flaming blades performed without any technique. If Ralner had been in his normal state, his exquisite swordplay would have allowed him to fine-tune his tactics, but at this point, it was good enough that he wasn't attacking his allies. Still, Jake and the others had to stop him for his own sake, but more importantly for their own. If the hunters who had been cut in half were dead or badly injured, the same could not be said for the hundreds of burning monsters. The reddish flames consuming them quickly died down, while the energy levels of these creatures suddenly began to skyrocket. With his Murtharian sight, Jake saw the dark energy flowing through their meridians pulsate intensely, and this instantly triggered a wave of mutation. Slowly, but with a speed noticeable to the naked eye, the hunters began to grow and their sallow gray skin took on a familiar reddish hue. "Stop him," Jake yelled, fearing the worst. He thought the 2 sisters would be helpless, but their hair suddenly turned white, and a pure, holy aura enveloped their weapons. Only then did Jake remember that their pink hair was a hybrid color reflecting their affinity for 2 elements. Red was the mark of a fire mage or knight, while white corresponded to light, life, or purification. It was not the same type of light he produced, resulting from an electromagnetic wave, but something else, recognizable indeed by its pure, white radiance. Since he knew them, the 2 sisters had never used this ability, for lack of means, but they appeared to have finally solved this problem. Now it remained to be seen if it would work at all. "Light spell, cleansing ray," Essia shouted cutely as she aimed her mage staff at Ralner. Enya didn't bother shouting the name of her spell, but she also waved the scepter in her hand, shrouding a portion of the cavern in light like sunbeams piercing the clouds after a long storm. This radiance fell on the monsters, who didn't seem to mind, but Jake noticed the dark energy in their veins recede momentarily before slowly continuing to build up. Nevertheless, the evolutionary process of these creatures had slowed tremendously, almost coming to a halt for those that had been lightly hit by Ralner's flames. "Well done. Keep going," Jake exclaimed, pleasantly surprised. The others gave them a thumbs up as well, and taking advantage of the respite, Mahanjal produced another soothing flower to calm his friend blinded by his murderous wrath. Jake took the opportunity to absorb the remaining flames in his body and charged forward at supersonic speed into the group of giant hunters still blocking their way. Chapter 474: Slaughtering Parasites. Cackle. The 6-meter-tall huge hunter in his way started to cackle madly when he saw a human missile crashing into him. Raising his fists in the air like an enraged gorilla, they turned into huge keratin hammers, then slammed down hard with all their weight as Jake came within range. A calculating glint flashed fleetingly in Jake's pupils as he snorted dismissively. Stepping on the air as if it were a springboard, he avoided both hammer fists with a forward somersault, only to bring down his spinning right heel coated in gray ether right onto the top of the enemy's skull. Though sturdy, the parasite's skull instantly exploded like an overripe pumpkin. The controller on his shoulder let out a high-pitched howl of terror and clumsily tried to leap onto a nearby monster's back, but Jake hatefully crushed it with his fist before giving it a chance. Grabbing the headless hunter by the foot, He then used it as a club to bash the other beasts and began to whirl around at breakneck speed, knocking out everything in his path. The arm holding the corpse became a melting pot of warm colors due to the massive surge of strength, agility, and constitution ether, and his striking speed increased tenfold again. The left arm holding the slain hunter dropped out of sight of his comrades, so fast that the whole strike sequence was akin to an ultra-high-frequency vibration. The supersonic whirring of the wind caused by Jake's every move reverberated throughout the cavern, and dozens of gigantic hunters were hurled into the air like cannonballs, their condition uncertain. A few seconds later, Jake stopped swinging his arm like a maniac on steroids, and it reappeared, red and smoking. The hunter, held like a hammer in his hand, couldn't withstand this dazzling sequence of impacts, accelerations and decelerations, and all that was left of its headless body was the crushed limb that Jake clutched in his hand. When he clenched his fist, what was left of it crumbled into dust instantly. Turning around, he noticed that he had moved a little too far forward, but fortunately his companions had kept up, using his breakthrough to move forward as well. With each step Mahangel took, an emerald wave would ripple through the ground, and a tangle of vines would form on either side of the party, creating a safe and regal route for the team. Hefi's was somewhat countered by the two sisters' cleansing light, but as soon as a trail of shadows appeared before him, a hunter would die. Leaving the big guys to the others, he instead focused on the controllers, having already eliminated a dozen of them. Kyle and Tim were also participating as best they could, taking out the smaller hunters. The Playboy's mindset shift was starting to pay off. His ether stats had clearly increased compared to the beginning of the ordeal, and his bloodline skills seemed more powerful than before, especially his golden sight and his warrior trance. Jake was willing to bet that his Myrmidian bloodline had finally reached level 2. Where Jake's and the others' first ordeal had lasted only 2 months, the boys had lasted over 5 years. That was 5 long years to perfect his mastery of various weapons and fighting techniques. While that didn't make him any bigger, the truth was that they had underestimated him. If Jake had to face the child with equal size and stats, he was not sure to prevail. That was a major blow to him. Of course, because his intelligence was so much higher, his technique was progressing abnormally fast. Even if he were to become normal again, the knowledge and experience he had gained would not disappear. Whether or not he would actually lose to Tim in a one-on-one fight if they had the same stats was actually hard to tell. Glancing at Carmen behind him, he was mind-blown by her fighting style. Chugging down another vial of his blood, Jake saw her ruby irises fill with silver and gold sparks reminiscent of stars revolving around a galaxy. The roots of her long brown hair were slowly but surely turning silver, while her fangs and nails were quickly becoming translucent. The blood in her veins was heating up, and a phenomenon reminiscent of Jake's lava veins began to appear on her own body. To his utter disbelief, Carmen was literally tapping into the powers of his Myrtharian bloodline. Without realizing it, a lower form of Myrtharian spiritual and warrior trance activated within her, as well as Myrtharian sight, enabling her to distinguish the weaknesses of her enemies. As her body grew in temperature, her explosiveness and stamina increased accordingly, and the blood energy she used in all her techniques began to boil over against her will. Already enjoying superhuman strength and speed as a quasi-vampire, her performance went up several notches, and she began to rip apart one monster after another, her fighting prowess only behind that of Jake and Mahangel. Jake had taken every precaution to ensure that his blood contained nothing but his cells, but his ether code could not be erased. The ether content of these ether runes was too low to compare to Jake's powers, but it was enough to give her a glimpse. As a blood human, her bloodline specialized in absorbing and using humanoid blood, and the better those samples were, the more her own bloodline would be stimulated and the greater the power she could draw from them. Had Carmen been part of their faction and benefited from the Myrtharian body passive, perhaps her performance would have been even more impressive. In the end, the least useful person in the group was Ostrexera. Floating above them, the cantankerous young woman merely patrolled in a circle nonchalantly, striking only when a monster got too close to her. She seemed to have an uncanny knack for bending the air to direct her screams, and no one could hear what she was hollering when she did open her mouth. However, The victims she targeted with these sound waves had all exploded without exception. Jake had already experienced Ostrexera's powers, so he knew that she excelled in the field of soul and spirit, but he didn't really know what her bloodline was. Sometimes she would behave like a ghost, but sometimes she would use a perfectly tangible body, made of flesh and blood. This woman was a real enigma, but the only thing that remained constant was her absolute hatred for men. While she was always friendly to the girls in the party, it was impossible to get anything but a scowl of disgust when one of the males tried to talk to her. If Jake wasn't the leader and her village's lord, she might not have even bothered to pay him any heed. With such coordination and a flurry of high-level moves, the group blasted their way through with frightening efficiency, obliterating and butchering any monsters that dared to stand in their way. After a minute or so, the controller's shrill cries ceased, and a relative silence filled the tunnel they had just ventured into. Hephi's had finally disposed of the last controller, his abject corpse neatly skewered at the tip of the Aegean assassin's sword. In contrast, their ferocity multiplied and the horde went into a frenzy, using their fearlessness to overwhelm them by sheer numbers. However, due to their lunacy, they had lost all sense of proportion and several hundred were stampeded by their brethren in a matter of moments. Exploiting the confusion, Jake and his party were able to push forward much more easily. The number of parasites chasing them had grown exponentially, but they were no longer able to contain their advance. Within minutes, every member of the team had become bloodied from head to toe. Despite this, Jake noticed that most of the giant hunters had retreated after half of them had been slaughtered in the beginning of the battle. They were backing off every time they stepped forward, conserving their strength for some unknown purpose. It was clearly not fear that was driving their withdrawal, but a vicious glimmer of understanding that did not bode well for them. Seeing this, Jake's forehead scrunched up, but he did not try to stop them. Thanks to their large size, they provided a protective wall for the group, which paradoxically made their lives easier. About 15 minutes later, after having crossed 7 galleries several kilometers long and as many caverns, the group landed in a gigantic cave, quite different from the others. This one contained no tank filled with foreign mixture, nor green lava, lightning, ice, poisonous gases, and no acid lake as they had encountered in the previous caves, but instead a dozen hunters and 3 very special controllers were waiting for them there. They had almost gotten lost on the way, the light arrow repeatedly pointing in a totally different direction, but they had eventually arrived at their destination. For in the center, between those 12 gigantic hunters and 3 controllers, sat an object identical to the replica Jake held in his hands. Chapter 475 Jinxed. Jake and the others were about to charge into the fray as they had been doing until now, but they unexpectedly wavered when they saw the small contingent of parasites protecting the purgatory artifact. The 12 hunters were the largest they had encountered so far, approaching 10 meters in height, and their bodies were now covered with a metallic shimmering chitin forming a natural armor. This chitin and their entire limbs could extend, retract, and sharpen as they pleased, coming very close to the characteristics of the original digesters, of which they were but a pale copy. Yet Jake and his group didn't give them more than a passing glance. As big and beefy as they were just small fry. What fully captured their attention this time were the 3 controllers in the background. They looked like grayish spiders with a width of about a meter, their heads and upper limbs growing on them like mushrooms. They no longer looked like dehydrated babies, but like grotesque children still with one silver eye. Planted atop their skulls, it functioned like a ball-jointed antenna and had no blind spots. The reason Jake and the others had momentarily flinched was because they could feel a frightening spiritual pressure radiating from these 3 insignificant creatures. These controllers now seemed qualified to control far more than their congeners. Jake, Ostrexera, Mahangel, or Hephi's could certainly resist this kind of compulsion, Carmen, and the 2 sisters perhaps to a lesser extent, but Rauner, Tim, and Kyle were vulnerable prey. Boom. They didn't have time to decide on any tactics when a deafening explosion detonated above them. The shockwave rocked the ground and heavily shook the cave they were in. Only the fluid artifact in the center continued to hover unaffected. The battle between Sigmar, his son, and Minerva was escalating and had crept dangerously close to them. This commotion, far from panicking the 15 parasites, acted more like a clarion call to attack. The 12 hunters stretched out their arms into a farcical quadrupedal stance and began to gallop toward them with the momentum of a full-blown tank. Jake and his comrades paled slightly as they realized they had underestimated their speed, but it was too late to turn back. Triat. The three controllers also let out a synchronized wail, and like Jake and Ostrexera had done before, the sound wave was channeled and redirected at them through a spiritual funnel. Tim instinctively hid in Jake's shadow to let him take the brunt of the attack, while Kyle did the same, hiding behind Tim. Rauner, who was barely lucid, stood there like an idiot and took the mental wave with full force. For a long second, he stood still, staring blankly, and for a moment Jake thought they would be torn to pieces by the oncoming hunters. He would have preferred that. Instead, the Fire Knight turned around, swung his flaming sword, and slashed sideways at his friend Mahangil, who was standing next to him. This was not the Wood Archmage's first battle, and a thick wall of bark rose between the two, but a fiery blast ensued that sent them both flying. Kyle and Tim back off. Jake shouted urgently as he saw the other two controllers move around him to target them. Cackle. The hunters in pursuit had caught up with them, and their retreat was cut off completely, depriving Kyle and Tim of that option. Carmen single-handedly obstructed the hundreds of monsters pouring out of the galleries behind them, but the damage was done. The teenager actively searched for a workaround, but his luck seemed as lost as he was in this situation. FUCK off. Jake roared in anger as he returned a frontal kick when the first giant hunter pounced on him, preventing him from assisting his friends. His foot, weighing several tons, sank between the monster's eyes and the monster's skull caved in a couple of inches. With his foot embedded in the enemy's skull up to the ankle, he followed up with a side kick with the same leg, violently kicking it away from the hunter's shattered head. The other group members also engaged in combat with their own opponents. After the instant death of the first hunter, the other 11 spontaneously switched targets, and Jake momentarily found himself left without an opponent. This was not exactly great news for his companions. Kyle and Tim, who had been playing cat and mouse to avoid the controller's sneaky mental attacks, found themselves locked in a tough fight against a hunter several times their size whose chitin and bones were strong enough to take all their hits. When his sword broke against his opponent's femur, a determined expression appeared on Kyle's face. Gaining momentum, he grabbed Tim by the collar and threw him into the monster's face. In return, he was smashed by two gigantic arms transformed into a flail. Both sisters cringed in horror as they thought he had been bludgeoned to death, but when the monster collapsed backwards after Tim had plunged the butt of his axe into its eye, a shocked but very much alive Kyle reappeared before them. Just before impact, Jake had used his powers to soften the rock beneath him. Instead of being crushed between two hard surfaces, he had simply sunk, before resurfacing a few seconds later. Nevertheless, he had not escaped unscathed. His arms and legs had taken the full brunt of the impact and suffered multiple fractures. He struggled to get up while stabbing his sword into the ground, uncorked one of the healing potions provided by Kawani, and immediately recovered his health. Meanwhile, the fight between Rauner and Mahangil had reached its climax, and surprisingly, the Wood Archmage did not have the advantage. Because he refused to hurt his friend and his element was countered by his comrades' flames, he was stuck in a defensive posture that was gradually weakening. Tim was just congratulating himself on his victory over Kyle's hunter when his own opponent came charging back and slammed into him like a battering ram. The teen's body flew for 100 meters before hitting a wall, his condition uncertain. Just before the attack, the two controllers had finally managed to pin him down and his body had gone temporarily stiff, his mind spacing out with no chance for his luck to change anything. Damn it. Ephies. Ostrexera. What the hell are you doing? Jake yelled, now completely infuriated as he waved his hands wildly, as if trying to eviscerate the air. The hunter Kyle was facing was brutally impaled by a gigantic rock stalactite bursting out of the ground below him, the rock spike growing so fast that the monster soon crashed into the ceiling of the cave. At the same time, the controller manipulating Rauner like a puppet was also pierced by a rock spear, as was the hunter Essio was facing. Unfortunately, in the case of the Fire Knight, this did not stop his frenzy. As if to prove he wasn't playing around, One of the controllers who had targeted Tim also staggered to his feet before collapsing dead, his brain pierced by a shadow blade. The last controller died in a similar fashion within the same second. Hephies had used Tim and Kyle as bait to sneak up and murder them. Ostrexera, on the other hand, had not given a damn since the beginning, just floating passively above them and gloating over their misfortune. If she had wanted to, none of this would have happened. Unfazed by the drama around her, she continued to act as if she didn't hear anything, and an untold fury began to fester in Jake's mind. By then, Essia had managed to dash to the teenager's rescue. Miraculously, he was not yet dead, the wall having cushioned his fall turning out to be more friable than expected. Regaining consciousness after swallowing the potion that Essia had made him drink, the kid threw a hateful glare at the ghostly woman when he saw her indifference. Holy shit, I wasted all my luck just to not die? I'm going to be jinxed for several hours after this. Tim ranted, gritting his teeth in frustration. Sacrificing his luck to physically affect reality was far beyond his current abilities and had severe consequences. Crazed with rage and under the influence of corruption, his overflow of emotion due to the perceived injustice caused an irreversible mood shift. With a disturbing coldness, he glared at Ostrexera and muttered ominously, "But I will not be alone. You will share my misfortune." If the others could see his ether stats at that moment, they would have found that his ether luck stat already in the negative had suddenly started to plummet. From 8, it went to 50, 100, 500, before leveling off at 1,000. When this happened, Ostrexera's indifferent and disdainful countenance suddenly changed. Aghast, she turned to the child, and a terrific mental force darted towards Tim with the sole purpose of killing him. A silent shriek comparable to that of the controllers was focused on Tim, but she missed him by a good number of feet. Struck silly by her lack of accuracy, Ostrexera was even more mystified by what came next. "Sorry guys, the adventure ends here for me. At least Lily won't be alone anymore," Tim said with a wry smile. Amidst all the confusion, the teenager closed his eyes, and in front of a flabbergasted Essia, the crumbling wall behind him exploded completely, shattered by the wild charge of a 13th hunter coming out of nowhere. The poor Tim who was in his way had already been trampled to death and covered with tons of rubble. A blade of flame intended for Mahangel suddenly hit her in the face when she was in her solid state, and she tumbled for several meters before neutralizing the flames with her powers. Even so, the arm that parried the attack was already burned to the 3rd degree. Suddenly, the previously grudging and hateful looks of Jake and his friends became sympathetic, wishing her their heartfelt condolences. Death sentence by misfortune? Was there any better revenge than that? Nicely done, Tim. They thought hard in their heads with a flush of admiration. Even dead, he could still be a pain in the ass to his enemies.